Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the February OSAP recipient meeting. Today's format is going to be the same as yesterday's, with all participants joining in webinar mode.
Good morning,
A
everyone.
quick reminder. Sorry, thought I heard somebody. There are a few housekeeping items that we want to remind you all about. Please use the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask questions and raise your hand to be unmuted. Someone from Coop Consulting will be supporting the moderation of the chat and the Q&A. Presenters will be given permissions to be unmuted and visible immediately before their presentation. Please note that attendance is being taken via the Zoom reports. Please note that the meeting is being recorded. All presentations and a recording of the meeting is going to be available via email and on the New Mexico Prevention website following the meeting. If you experience any technical difficulties during the meeting, Jennifer Espinosa Ruiz from Coop Consulting is available by phone to help you troubleshoot. That number is 269-220-0039, and usually Jennifer places that into the chat in case you need to get that number again. Our first presentation today will be on the 2019 YRRS findings for high-risk groups, provided by Dan Green from the New Mexico Department of Health and Courtney FitzGerald from the UNM Prevention Research Center. Welcome, Dan and Courtney. It's all yours.
Okay. All right. Hey. Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, everybody, for inviting us. I'm Dan Green. I'm with the New Mexico Department of Health, and I'm here with my colleague, Courtney FitzGerald from UNM, who's going to help me do this presentation. And we're coming into this thinking that most people know quite a bit about the YRRS, and hopefully maybe you've seen some of the presentations that we've given so far. So we're going to go through some of this stuff kind of quick at the beginning. Talk first about what is the YRRS, but it is a biennial survey, so it happens every 2 years of public high school and middle school students. There are a lot of partners that go through to make this a successful endeavor. So we work closely with the CDC Division of Adolescent and School Health. They are heading up the YRBS Youth Risk Behavior Survey nationally. They do a national survey at the same time they do surveys in almost every state. So it's a pretty big endeavor, and they've got a lot of great resources themselves, and they're great helps to all of us who are working on this project. Of course, the New Mexico Department of Health, the New Mexico Public Education Department, and the UNM Prevention Research Center, kind of the three main partners that actually plan the survey and get it going. We also have some really important input and participation from the BHSD, OSAP, from the Albuquerque Area Southwest Tribal Epidemiology Center, or AZTEC, and that is a group that is really helping us to make sure that we have an adequate representation of tribal youth, of Native American youth. Oh, I'm supposed to be sharing my screen, aren't I? Sorry. Let me go ahead and do that.
You were doing a great job, Dan. I just was thinking,
okay.
want the presentation visible to everyone.
I just totally forgot. I'm just doing my own presentation for myself here, I guess, there. But you can see my screen now, is that right? Okay. So, and now I need to rearrange a couple of windows here. Okay, great. Albuquerque Area Southwest Tribal Epicenter. So they've been they're a really great partner for us. The Navajo Nation Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So this is done by Navajo Nation with the Indian Health Board and Navajo Department of Health, and they do a a YRBS survey at the same time that we do our YRS survey. Every 3 years they do theirs, so we land on the same year fairly often, every 6 years, more often sometimes. Well, this year because of COVID, we are having more overlap in our schedules than normal. But again, a really important partner for this survey in getting Native American participation. And then our most important partner, we do feel like, is the school districts and schools. We cannot do this without participation and buy-in and enthusiastic participation from school districts and schools. And I think probably a lot of you have gotten calls from me or from Courtney or from somebody at UNM trying to kind of strategize to get some more participation from school districts and schools. So we really appreciate that help. But they are the ones that really are the ones that can make this survey a success. The types of information that we collect with the YRS are here. Mostly it's a behavior survey. So we ask about behaviors around injury, violence and bullying, mental health, suicidal behaviors, alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, sexual activity, physical activity, and nutrition. We also have a section on resiliency and protective factors, which is not part of the national survey. Those are state added New Mexico questions. We ask a couple of questions about health outcomes, so asthma and obesity. And then we also ask a bunch of questions about demographic characteristics, and those have expanded in the last several years now to include gender identity, sexual identity, living situations, homelessness, and things like that. And those questions have been really key to making this survey even more useful than it had been in the past before we added those types of questions. So really briefly, what is the survey? What can it tell us and what can't it tell us? This is a little, it's an important thing to remember here. But the survey it's a point in time survey. We do it every 2 years, and it does tell us what kids are doing when we do the survey. But what it cannot do is tell us why they do it. There is nothing in the survey that that points to the why, and we really rely on people from local areas to tell us why they think some of these things might be happening. But the survey really is just a measure of behaviors and characteristics that are happening at the time we do the survey. Closely associated to that is that the survey gives us associations, but it doesn't give us causes. And this is really important to remember, because I think a lot of what is in the survey does kind of invite people to think that there is a cause and effect association there that's going on, but it's not. The survey will tell us that certain groups of kids have a higher prevalence of certain types of behaviors. So you might see that kids who report sadness and hopelessness are more likely to use alcohol than other kids. This is an association. This is not a cause. It is not telling us that sadness and hopelessness causes alcohol or drug use. There's a lot of evidence that relationship goes both ways. So it's really not showing us a cause. Other associations that are just there, and we know it, the kids who drink alcohol are more likely to smoke cigarettes. It's not necessarily that one of those things causes the other. Those two behaviors are co-occurring often. And again, it's not a cause, it's just an association. The survey will tell us trends, so it'll tell us what's happened in past years and kind of what direction behaviors are moving in. But it cannot tell us predictions, and we see that we do have positive trends that are going in one direction, and then sometimes they'll just turn around. So we can't ever kind of, the trends are not a sign of what is going to happen in the future. And finally, the survey does give us general information about groups of kids, but it does not give us specific information about individual kids. So it's not really something that could be used to evaluate a particular intervention on specific kids. The survey is it's private, it's confidential. There's no way for us to track the behaviors of any specific individual, and that is actually the strength of the survey as a surveillance instrument. Okay, so getting right onto the data, then we've got very good data from 2019. We went to almost 40,000 kids in middle school and high school. So 20,000 respondents in middle school, 19,000 respondents in high school. We had response rates of 74% in middle school, 70% in high school. So these are both very high response rates, very good response rate. This is the most important measure that we have of data quality, and we consider anything to be over 60% to be a very high quality. So this is good data, and we can have a lot of confidence in it. Okay, so just to get onto the data that we're going to present today, we are mainly going to be talking about youth at high risk. So these 5 groups are the groups that we have identified in the past several years as being at higher risk than most students in the survey. So these are students who are born outside of the United States, students who are homeless, students who have physical disabilities or long-term health problems, lesbian, gay, or bisexual students, and gender minority students, or transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid. We're going to talk about each one of those groups and kind of the risk and resiliency factors that are important within those groups. And we will start with our matching game. I think a lot of people have seen this, but the way this works is that we have this list of indicators on the left-hand side of the screen. We've got a list of prevalence numbers on the right-hand side of the screen. So what we want you to do is when we go to born outside the USA, the prevalence of students in high school who were born outside of the United States appears on the right side of the screen there, and we want you to match that up. And I think we have a poll. Is that right?
We do have.
There we go. Thank you. Do you want to explain that at all, or?
Would you like us to?
I guess probably people know what to do. Just pick what the prevalence of that you think is for students who are born outside of the United States.
Great, thanks, Dan. So the responses are coming in, so we'll just give that a couple more moments, and then Jennifer will go ahead and share the results. Great. It looks like some of those responses have slowed. So Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and share those results.
So it looks like most people chose 7.5%, and that is exactly correct. 7.5% of the students in high school in New Mexico were born outside of the United States. There's a lot more to the importance of this than just whether or not kids were born outside of the United States. For instance, we can look at this and we can see that more than 50% of those students who were born not in the United States did speak a non-English language at home at least half the time, so 55%. And we see that more than 1/4 of them spoke a non-English language at home all of the time. And this is important because we know that there's a lot of evidence that rapid acculturation to a new country is often associated with higher levels of risk-taking. And also that immigrants who retain connection to their home culture for a time may be somewhat protected from a lot of risk-taking. So of course, language is not a complete indicator of acculturation, but it may be an important marker, and we'll discuss whether or not that speaking a non-English language may actually be an indicator of some amount of protection for a lot of the indicators that we look at later in the survey. Our next poll question is about homelessness. So what is the percentage that you believe are homeless? So thanks, just click on the rate that you think corresponds to that. So do we have a response from the group? 5.2%. I think maybe somebody's seen this presentation before. 5.2% is the correct number. And the way that breaks down is this. This is our question. During the past 30 days, where did you usually sleep is the question. And this group of answers: at the home of family or friends, in a shelter, emergency housing, motel, hotel, car park, campground, or other public place, or no usual place. All of those students are considered to be homeless. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. Another question: physical disabilities or long-term health problems. Can we have the poll for that? So, you know, this is always a fun exercise for me. I think it's really helpful. We're not really trying to test people, but I think it is fun to see, you know, how your preconceptions of what the data look like and who's in the survey and what their behaviors are. It's fun to kind of test those preconceptions with what the actual answer is. And do we have a response from the group? So we have 3.2% and 11.6% are the popular choices this time, and the actual percentage is 13%. So 13% of the kids have long-term health problems or physical disabilities. Whoops, and that's all that we know about these students as far as what their disability is. This is, but you could say this is a weakness. So we don't know actually what their physical disability is. We don't know if it's, you know, eyesight, whether it's mobility, hearing, or anything like that. There's really important distinctions between all of those different kinds of disabilities that people might have, of course. So we do not know exactly what the disability is for students. However, we do know that they are, if they have any disability at all, they are at a higher risk for a lot of things. So we think that the question is really important, very informative the way that it is. And lesbian, gay, or bisexual is the next question. And so can we have the results for that? 14.6% is what people are saying, and that's what we have. 14.6% say lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It's important to also notice that we have another category on this question, and that is not sure of sexual identity, and that's 4.6% of the students. And together, LGB or not sure of sexual identity make 19.1% of the students. And for most of this presentation and most of our presentations that we give, we are going to put those two groups together because we do believe that well, we can see easily that the risk profile of those students who say not sure is very much like the students who say they're lesbian, gay, or bisexual. They're facing the same groups of risk, and so we're going to include them together, and we'll talk again about that more. And I think maybe just to speed this up a little bit, maybe we should just go through these last couple without doing the whole poll. But transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid, I'll just give you a second to think about what the prevalence of that might be. And okay, the poll's up. I'm gonna hit it anyway. Let's just go ahead and just keep in mind what you said on the poll, and the answer is 3.2%. 3.2%, as with the LGB question, there is a category for not sure, which is 2.8%. And again, we do see that those students who say not sure about their gender identity, the risk profile is very similar to those who say that they are transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid. So we have a total of 6% of all students. And then one or more of those core characteristics. So each of those groups of kids is a minority of students. When we roll them all up together, still a minority of students, but a pretty sizable group of students that have at least one of those characteristics, about a third. So 34.5% of all students had at least one of these characteristics. Here are all of the answers to our matching game. And so that's the risk, those are the groups. We're going to be talking about the risk behaviors they face in a minute, but just really quickly to go over kind of what the resiliency profile looks like for each group. We have 5 groups of questions about resiliency or about protective factors. So we have resiliency within the family, within school, in the community. So not in the family or not in the school is how we define community. And with peers and with the personal resiliency factors, these are characteristics like intention to continue school after high school, involvement in activities like music or sports or things like that, that are not in the community and not in the school. So kind of personal interests there. And these are the prevalence for all students, these blue bars for prevalence for all students of those who say they have the very highest level of resiliency factors for each of those. So in family, 31% of students say they have the highest level of resiliency within the family. When we add the group that's born outside of the United States, you can see that for each one of these resiliency factors, these students are reporting substantially lower levels of resiliency. We see even more extreme relationship there for homeless students. Homeless students are very unlikely to report most of these resiliency factors. Only 10%, 9.7% say they have these strong family relationships. Students with physical disabilities still much lower for most of these things than all students, but still some bright spots. They have nearly the same level of resiliency for these personal factors. And transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid students, again, very low levels of all of the resiliency factors. And LGB students, again, pretty low levels of all the resiliency factors. So you can see that for each of these groups, they do have less resiliency or protective factor characteristics than other students. And this is most pronounced for the transgender students and for the homeless students. And I'm going to pass this off now to Courtney so she can go through part of the presentation.
Dan's going to keep controlling the slides, though. Thank you, Dan. So we're going to go through each one of these groups and kind of give you a bit of information about each one individually. So we'll start with students who are born outside of the United States. We call this our nativity question. And the question is, were you born in the USA? And they can answer yes or no. So there are things we know about these students based on other data from our survey. So we know their race and ethnicity, and we know whether the language that they usually speak more than half the time at home is English or some other language. We don't know what that non-English language is if they're speaking a language other than English. We don't know what country those students were born in. And we don't know how long they've lived in the United States, although on the 2021 survey that we'll be doing hopefully this fall, we will ask this question a little differently, and we're going to ask how long students have lived in the United States. So we'll have that information in the next survey, but we don't have it for 2019. And finally, we don't know other cultural characteristics that may be relevant to students who were born outside the USA. So Dan mentioned earlier that language can be a piece of acculturation, and it helps as some possible indication of acculturation, but it's not a complete marker. There's other cultural aspects that go into that, but that's what we have in the YRRS. So let's go ahead and talk about our breakdown. So Dan showed you a slide a little while ago that kind of showed the percent of students and what language they speak. This is the race and ethnicity of students born outside the US. And the pie on the left is middle school and the pie on the right is high school. And we have some groups that are overrepresented in our immigrant community compared to in the community overall. So in middle school, Hispanic students make up about half of students born outside of the US. Hispanic students overall in middle school make up about half, so that's about the same. But in high school, we have 60.2% of our students who are born outside of the US who identify as Hispanic, and that's much higher than overall in high school for New Mexico, where 50.9% of our students identify as Hispanic. We also have overrepresentation among our Asian and Pacific Islander students. They make up 16.9% of the middle school students born outside the US and 13.3% of the high school students born outside the US. They only make up 3.6% of overall in the middle school students and only 2.4% overall in the high school students. So they're very overrepresented in our immigrant population. Also, Black and African American students are overrepresented among students born outside the US. So they make up 7.4% of foreign-born students in middle school and 5.6% of foreign-born students in high school. African American students comprise only 5% of our middle school students overall and only 3% of our high school students overall. So they're overrepresented among students born outside the US compared to in the general population. We also have a couple groups that are underrepresented, and this may not be a surprise. American Indian students are underrepresented here. They make up in the general population 13% of our high school students and 14% of our middle school students, and they only make 5.6% of our high school students born outside the US and 8.9% of our middle school students born outside the US. And white students make up about 25.6% of our middle school students overall and 30.4% of our high school students overall. So they're underrepresented, only making up 16.6% of foreign-born middle school students and 15.3% of foreign-born high school students. So we can look at nativity by race and ethnicity in our middle schools and high schools to see what proportion of students were born in the US and what proportion were born outside of the US by race ethnicity. So these bars, each pair of bars equals 100%. So of our American Indian students in middle school, 96.1% were born in the US, only 3.9% were born outside the US. You can see that among our Asian or Pacific Islander students specifically, we have kind of a large proportion that were born outside of the US relative to those born inside the United States. For the rest, the kids born outside of the US make up a much smaller proportion than the ones born inside the US. So we can look at nativity with risk factors in our survey. So the bar chart you're looking at here shows that among the United States born students, only 7.7% engage in current cigarette smoking. That is, they smoked a cigarette in the last 30 days. And that's compared to 14.6% of students who were born outside of the US who are current cigarette smokers. And that's 2 times the prevalence of those born inside the US. So we have a disparity there for kids who are foreign born. And we look at binge drinking, 11.1% of US born kids binge drank. That's 5 or more drinks on a single occasion for boys and 4 or more drinks on a single occasion for girls. Kids who were born outside of the US, though, that prevalence was 14.4%. And even though that point estimate's a little bit different, there's statistically no difference between kids born in the US and kids born outside of the US for binge drinking. We can look at marijuana use as well. We see very close point estimates, again, overlapping confidence intervals. That means there's no statistical difference between kids born in the US and kids born outside of the US for current marijuana use. However, we can look at some tougher drugs like cocaine. We can see that among those kids born in the US, only 3.1% used cocaine compared to 15.9% of students born outside of the US. And that's a 5 times greater rate of cocaine use for our kids born outside the US. For heroin use, we see even bigger disparity. Only 1.7% of US born students used heroin. 15.3% of foreign born students used heroin, and that's a 9 times difference there. So we have very big disparities for some of these drugs that we're concerned about with the YRRS. Excuse me. Looking at violence, school safety, and bullying, we can see that foreign-born kids are not any differently likely to be bullied on school property. There's no difference between those kids born in the US and kids born outside the US. However, when we look at students who skipped school because of safety concerns, you can see that there's quite a large disparity there. Only 12.9% of students born in the US said that they skipped school due to safety concerns, either at school or on the way to or from school, whereas 20.5% of students born outside the US. And we can see that that's probably not related to bullying, since the prevalence of bullying doesn't look really different between those two populations. I'm just going to propose that it might have something to do with kids not feeling safe with immigration status, possibly going to school, but that would be something our communities could tell us better than we could guess. And we can also look at sexual assault. This is children who were forced to have sexual intercourse when they didn't want to. Only 10.8% of students born in the US experienced sexual assault, compared to 16.3% of students born outside the US. So again, we have a disparity there for our foreign-born kids. We can look at mental health and suicide behaviors by nativity, and this is among high school students again. So there's really no difference in students feeling sad or hopeless, seriously considering suicide, or making a suicide plan. However, when we look at students who actually made an attempt at suicide in the past 12 months, we see almost a 2 times greater rate among students born outside the US. For kids born in the US, 9.4% made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months, whereas 17.5% of students born outside the US made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. So there is a disparity there as well. We can look at homelessness by nativity. So among our students born in the United States, only 3.9% were homeless, whereas 20.7% of our students born outside the US indicated that they slept somewhere other than in the home of their parent or guardian. So it's a 5 times greater rate compared to students born inside the US. All right, so as Dan talked about earlier, some research has established that for students who are born outside of the US, that speaking their native language, assuming that language is not English, can have a protective effect. That's due to acculturation, probably. So speaking English at home might be a sign of acculturation. So we can actually look to see if we see that happening in our data by looking at nativity along with language spoken at home, and whether there's a relationship with some of the risk factors we measure in YRS. So this chart here is showing you the percent of students who spoke a language other than English at home at least half the time. So you can see that more than half of our Asian and Pacific Islander students and more than half of our Hispanic students who were born outside of the US were speaking a language other than English at home at least half the time. About 1/3 of the white students who were born outside the US spoke a foreign language at home, and a little more than 25% of the Black or African American students who were born outside the US spoke a language other than English at home. And we can look at, since we know this relationship between foreign born and language spoken at home, we can look at our data and see whether that shows up with some of the risk factors that we look at. So for example, this is current cigarette smoking by nativity and language spoken at home. You can see there's not really any difference between those who speak English at home compared to those who speak a foreign language, or sorry, I shouldn't say foreign because some people are speaking indigenous languages that are indigenous to the US. So let me say a language other than English at home. In the US, there's not really a difference between those kids, but we do see there's a difference between students born in the US and students born outside of the US, where we have kids born outside of the US with a higher prevalence of cigarette smoking compared to those born in the US. But there's not really a difference here between kids who are foreign born and speaking English at home and kids who are foreign born and speaking a language other than English at home. But we can look at some of our other risk factors and we do see some differences. So this is current marijuana use by country of birth and language spoken at home. Again, no difference really between the US born students, whether they're speaking English or non-English. And there's no difference between the US born students and students born outside the US who are speaking a non-English language at home. Where we see the difference is really in these foreign born students who are speaking English at home more than half the time, where they have the much higher prevalence of current marijuana use compared to the other students. We can also look at current heroin use. And again, this is a tougher drug than marijuana. We see that US born students who speak English at home have by far the lowest prevalence with 1.3%. And that's close to the same as the US born students that are speaking some other language at home. And again, we see the big disparities here for foreign born students overall, and in particular for foreign born students who are speaking English at least half the time at home, with the highest prevalence of current heroin use at 19.6%, which is almost 20 times higher than the US born students who speak English at home. Looking at sexual violence, we see a similar pattern where we have US born students. It doesn't matter too much what language they're speaking at home. We see a greater prevalence among our foreign born students, and especially among the foreign born students who speak English at home, that have the highest prevalence of sexual violence. And we can also look at, I think we have one more, right? Yeah, suicide attempts. So again, we see the lowest prevalence of suicide attempts among US born students who are speaking English at home. Everyone else is higher than them. And then we see that we have a much higher prevalence among our foreign born students who are speaking English at home. So for our foreign born students who are speaking some other language at home, that seems to have some protective effect because those students have a much lower prevalence compared to the ones who are speaking English at home. Oh, and we have homelessness too. Okay, again, same pattern, lowest rate of homelessness among US born students who are speaking English at home, higher among the other three groups, higher still among all the foreign born students, and highest among the foreign born students who are speaking English at home, where 30.1% of those students were homeless compared to only 3.3% of the US born students who spoke English at home. So now we're gonna switch gears a little bit since we've just talked about homelessness, and we'll just segue right on into the next population that's at very high risk for many of the things we are interested in with YRS, and that's our students who are homeless. So again, the question here is, during the past 30 days, where did you usually sleep? And this past survey round in 2019, we had a new question that is, during the past 30 days, did you ever sleep away from your parents or guardians because you were kicked out, ran away, or were abandoned? And this is really helping us to tease out among our students who were homeless, whether they were homeless with their parents and families or whether they were homeless on their own, or what we call unaccompanied. So Dan, showed this pie chart a little earlier in the matching game, but this is the breakdown of how students answered that question. Most of our students in high school were not homeless. 94.8% said they usually slept in the home of their parent or guardian, compared to just a small piece of pie. In the middle school, we have 3.6% were homeless. In the high school, it was 5.2%. Now we can look at homelessness by grade level. And what we see when we look at it by grade is that there's not really a big difference in the prevalence of homelessness by grade level. We can also look at it by age. So grade level is usually a good marker for age, but in this case, we actually see some important differences where grade level is not associated with homelessness. Age is absolutely associated with homelessness. So what Dan did that was really interesting was he took the median age for every grade level and compared students who were at the median age to those who were older than the median age. And what we found was that students who were older than their classmates, even just by 1 year, were more likely to be homeless than students who were median age for their grade level. So homeless students obviously are going to have a hard time with school. They have more absenteeism. They don't necessarily have easy environments to study in outside of school. So it's no wonder that they might be achieving less academically and having more trouble than advancing through grade levels on time. So it's not surprising that they'd be older than their classmates if they're experiencing homelessness. And speaking of academic achievement, we can also look at that. We can see that among middle school students and high school students, those that are not homeless are less likely to earn D's and F's compared to those who are homeless. And those who are not homeless are also more likely to earn A's and B's compared to students who are homeless. So we definitely have disparities in academic achievement based on housing status. We can look at homelessness by high-risk characteristics to see which students might be at higher risk for homelessness. So we can look at boys and girls and see that boys do have a higher prevalence of being homeless compared to girls. Boys are 6.5%, girls 3.7%. LGB and students unsure of their sexual identity are more likely than straight students to experience homelessness. Transgender, genderqueer, and gender fluid students and those unsure of their gender identity are much more likely to be homeless compared to their cisgender peers. Students born outside the US, as we already talked about, are more likely to experience homeless compared to those born inside the US. And unfortunately, students with disabilities and long-term health problems are also more than twice as likely to experience homelessness compared to students with no disabilities and long-term health problems. So among all of our other high-risk groups, we see homelessness is a problem and more prevalent for those students. And it's also more prevalent for boys than girls. We can look at some of our other risk factors for young people and see that homeless students are more likely than students in stable housing to be bullied at school. They're far more likely to skip school due to safety concerns, and they're more than 3 times as likely to experience sexual assault compared to students in stable housing. For mental health and suicidal behaviors, we see that homeless students are more likely to feel sad or hopeless by a little bit. They're more likely to seriously consider suicide and to make a suicide plan. And they're much more likely, by about 3 times, to have made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. Looking at alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, we can see that students who are homeless are 4 times as likely to smoke cigarettes compared to students in stable housing. They're 3 times more likely to be binge drinkers. That's 5 or more drinks for boys and 4 or more drinks for girls on a single occasion. Twice as likely to currently use marijuana. They are 16 times as likely to currently use cocaine. Only 2.3% of students in stable housing used cocaine compared to 36.7% of homeless students. And they are 30 times more likely to currently use heroin compared to students in stable housing. And we don't see odds that big in most of the things that we look at. These are really huge disparities that are happening with our homeless students. Definitely something to pay attention to. Finally, we can take a look at that new question about unaccompanied youth and see what % of our students were kicked out, ran away, or were abandoned by these high-risk characteristics. So boys, more likely than girls by a small margin to have been kicked out, ran away, or to be abandoned. LGB and students who are unsure of their sexual identity were more likely than straight students to have been kicked out, run away, or be abandoned. Transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, and those not sure of their gender identity were much more likely than their cisgender peers to have been kicked out, abandoned, or to run away. Students who were born outside the US also more likely than those born in the USA, and students with long-term health problems or physical disabilities almost 3 times as likely as those without disabilities to have been kicked out, to have run away, or to have been abandoned. So when we look at kicked out, run away, or were abandoned, we see that about 8.4% of our high school students in New Mexico were kicked out, ran away, or were abandoned in the past 30 days. And we can look at this with our homeless question. So 5.8% of all of our students ran away, were not homeless, but ran away. So these students chose to run away, but they weren't considered homeless. Whereas with the homeless students, we see that 2.1% of the students were homeless and they ran away or were kicked out or abandoned. So we consider those students unaccompanied. They were homeless without their parents. 3.1% of our high school students were homeless, but they weren't kicked out, ran away, or were abandoned. So those were homeless with their family or with their parents. And those student populations look different from each other. So we can look at selected risk behaviors by levels of homelessness. And what we see is the students who were not homeless, 9.0% of those students made a suicide attempt in the last 12 months. For students who were homeless but with their families, that goes up quite a bit to 24.8% making a suicide attempt. However, the students who are unaccompanied, that is homeless without their parents, almost 43% of those students made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. And we see that same pattern with sexual assault, with current heroin use, where only 1% of the students in stable housing, again, used heroin, and that goes up to 26.1% for students who were homeless but with their family, and then again, almost 42% of students who are homeless without their parents. And looking at academic achievement as well, we see that same pattern. We basically have an increase in the prevalence of students earning failing grades, whether when they're homeless with their parents, and then an even bigger increase when they're homeless without their family. Okay, highest level of resiliency factor. So Dan showed everyone that chart with the resiliency factor. These are students who said it was very much true that they had these protective factors at home. So homeless students have a much lower prevalence of feeling like they have these protective factors. So where 32.1% of the students in stable housing said it was very true that they have family members who are interested in their schoolwork and know where they are when they're not at home and who really care about them, that rate is only 9.7% for students who are homeless. And you see that same pattern in resiliency factors in school, in the community, among peers, and those individual resiliency factors like future orientation and involvement in activities is much lower for students who are homeless. We can look at selected risk behaviors by resiliency factors to see whether those resiliency factors are having some effect among our homeless students. So we can look at students who said it was not true at all versus those who said it was pretty much true versus those who said it was very much true, that they have these protective factors in place. And when we look at attempted suicide, we can see that the students who said it was not true at all, that they had these family protective factors, almost 40% of those students made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. For those students who said it was pretty much true that they had those family protective factors, 30% of those students made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. And then among the students who said it was very much true that they had those family protective factors, about 10% made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. So you can see that even among our homeless students, those family protective factors can be very, very important in protecting students from some of the risks that we're concerned about. Looking at sexual assault, we can see that same kind of that same pattern with personal protective factors. So again, this is future orientation, planning to attend school when you're done with high school, and also some involvement in activities that you're interested in. We can see that for students who said it was not true or pretty true, they had a higher prevalence of sexual assault compared to students who said it was very much true that they had those personal protective factors. When we look at heroin use, we can see that family protective factors have a really big influence, and peer protective factors can also have a big influence to protect young people from these behaviors. And we look at academic performance, we see that students who said it's very much true that they have family protective factors in place are much less likely to earn D's and F's compared to students who said it was pretty much true or not true at all. So that highest level of protective factor is really having an influence there on students' academic achievement. And I think I'm going to stop talking now and pass it back off to Dan. I don't know, Dan, do we want to take a break? Because I think we had at least one chat question.
Sure. Well, yeah, let's take some questions. I can't see the chat, so.
Okay.
I can read you. There is one question in the chat. So Karen asks, so what is the influence with foreign-born English speaker contributing to higher rates?
Do you want me to answer that, Dan?
Yes, please.
So Karen, there's a bunch of research that's emerging on young people who are speaking a language other than English at home when they're immigrant children, for the most part. Most of what I'd looked at is Hispanic girls and suicide attempts. But for young people who maintain a strong cultural identity and are tied strongly to their culture, research shows that they have a protective effect when coming to the United States, as long as they're maintaining that strong cultural identity. And what we see is this kind of shift that as young people become more like integrated into American culture, that they tend to lose that protective effect and actually come at higher risk. And we see something similar with what we call the Latino paradox, where with like diet that people who come from Latin American countries tend to come with a healthier diet initially, but then as they acculturate into American culture, their diet tends to get more Americanized and it increases their rates of diabetes and obesity. So we don't have a question about culture per se in the YRRS. The closest that we can get is this language spoken at home. So we can say, because language is a part of culture, it's definitely not inclusive of culture, but it's one aspect of culture. So for students born outside the US who are still speaking a language other than English at home most of the time, we are considering that possibly meaning that they may be more still connected to their culture of origin from their original country. We can't say that for sure based on these data, but that's one possibility for why we see that protective effect for language spoken at home. So I'm hoping I answered that well.
Thank you, Courtney. We have one more question, and then we also have a raised hand. So I'm going to pose the question first, and then we'll work behind the scenes to get Shara able to engage. So Natalie has a question in the chat. Thanks for this great presentation. Do you know when the middle school county reports will be published online?
That's a question.
I'll take that question since I'm the one that's preparing those middle school reports. You know, so the reports, all of our reporting is late this year, and I apologize for that. We lost about 6 months of working on our reports and analysis because of COVID. Much of the efforts that would have been spent on the YRS were actually directed towards COVID for several months. And so I do apologize that those middle school reports are not up yet. However, so all of the analysis is done for all of those reports. All of the data that is going to be driving that report is completed. And it still will be a while before, probably be, I'm really aiming at the end of next week to get the reports up. If you need something now, I can share you the data that is already done. That's not difficult at all. I don't have to do any extra work for that. I can give you the data for those middle school counties. Just let me know and I can get you that. If you can wait about a week and a half, it'll be up.
Thanks, Dan. And we have one comment from Jay who says you could look at Native American populations and see the same effects years ago. And I believe those were to Courtney's previous comments.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
It looks a little different now, but yeah, that language spoken at home was associated with some protection for Indigenous students in New Mexico years ago, although that's looking different now. But since I don't have anything definitive to say about that, I'm just going to have to leave it ambiguous. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Courtney. So Shara Thorpe has a question, and I'm going to unmute Shara now and allow that question to be posed. Shara, you should be all set.
Hi there. Thank you for answering my question. In my county, we have had a lot of staff turnover in the school district, and I'm wondering who we would contact in order to get information about the most recent school staff person so that our county and schools can be counted in YRS this year.
That's a good question. I'll tell you what we're doing. We're going to be contacting school districts starting with superintendents beginning in March to request district level approval for the survey to be completed in the fall. We start with superintendents, and then once superintendents say yes, then we approach principals and get their approval. When superintendents say no, we have to stop, but sometimes communities mobilize and put pressure on districts to do the survey. And then they contact us and ask to participate. So I think it's going to mean working with your district and whatever groups in your community use these data and feel that they're important to kind of mobilize and advocate for the survey to be done at the district level and with your principals once they are in place. So as far as like knowing who those folks are in each individual community, I don't know at this point. Dan, do you have better information about who could be worked with within a community?
You know, I think that's information that's going to kind of be coming together over the next couple of months, like you said. And we will have, I think that's going to be part of our next YRS presentation that is talking about what's coming with the 2021 YRS. Is that not what we've planned, Courtney, to kind of talk about how people can get a little more involved in their own?
It will be, here's what the survey is, here's what's new on the survey, here's what the electronic version of the survey is all about, and then the last part will be, here's how to advocate for the survey in your community. But I don't have specific contacts, right? It's more like here are ways you can get involved generally, and I don't have like specific people to contact, except, you know, beyond saying superintendent and principal.
Yeah, and we can work with you on that, on identifying specific people, but you know, it's always good to go to the principal or the superintendent and say, we really depend on these data. We are looking forward to participation in this school district, and we really appreciate you responding when you're contacted by UNM about the survey. It's very helpful to have. It's the most helpful thing to our participation in this survey is to have people from local areas in contact with the schools, with the school districts, and say, hey, we need these data. If they don't see a benefit to their own community of the survey, a lot of the people are just not going to want to participate. So. So we should probably get on. We've still got a little bit more to do on the, we've got 3 more groups to talk about.
We have a couple of more comments and questions in the chat.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So Christina says in the Latino community, cultural factors are protective factors, and perhaps dissecting what those could show different data as they are different than the ones we capture here. And Bernie has a question: when will benzo use questions be added to the survey?
So benzos, there's a long process for getting questions added to the survey. Benzodiazepines are not added to the national survey. We start with the national survey, and if we want to add questions to the survey, we do invite people to make a formal proposal to the YRS steering committee about questions that go on the survey. So about a year from now, we will start planning for the 2023 questionnaire. And at that time, we will be, soliciting proposals for new questions for that survey at that time. The 2021 questionnaire is completed. It's done. It's about ready to go. So it's too late to get any new questions on for that survey. And Courtney, do you want to comment on the Latino community cultural factors?
Perhaps dissecting what those are. I think that we have to remember the limitations of a YRS survey, these large population-based general health surveys that can't really dig into a lot of the context and complexity that surrounds some of the things that we find. Like, the purpose of these surveys is to kind of identify the prevalence and any disparities and any trends that we're seeing, but to really dig down into some of those other things like cultural factors that are super complex, I think requires different kinds of research. And so I think a lot of folks are doing that research. It would involve kind of like a literature review and reading a lot and kind of pulling things together to build a case for why we might be seeing that.
Okay, so well, let's go ahead and move on with the presentation. We'll have time for more questions at the end. We do want to also talk about students with physical disabilities or long-term health problems. And the question that we have for this is, do you have any physical disabilities or long-term health problems? And long-term means 6 months or more. So we don't know what specific physical disabilities or health problems students are living with. And this is a weakness of our question. But what we do know, and what makes this question so incredibly helpful, is that we do know that all these students who respond affirmatively to that question have a very pretty severe risk profile that we look at. So we do want to address that. So who are the students that are living with physical disabilities or long-term health problems? Well, these physical disabilities and health problems are not associated with sex, and they're not associated with age or grade level. However, they are associated with race, ethnicity, and they are also associated with parent education. Looking at race, ethnicity, we can see that the highest rate of physical disabilities or long-term health problems is reported among white students, and the lowest rate is reported among American Indian students. This could have a lot to do with just access to healthcare. Students who have better access to healthcare are more likely to have been diagnosed and to be aware of some things. And white students probably in general have a higher SES in this state and are probably more likely to have been diagnosed with certain conditions. Physical disabilities or long-term health problems by parent education. You can see that. So our question about parent education level is kind of a stand-in. It's a marker for socioeconomic status. So those students who report that their parents completed college education or professional school are thought to be at a higher SES status, and those students do have a higher level of physical disabilities or or long-term health problems. Again, this is very likely to be associated more with access to healthcare and their awareness of this than anything else. We can look at physical disabilities or long-term health problems and how they're associated with our other high-risk groups. So as has already been noted, the students with physical disabilities are much more likely, about twice as likely, to be homeless. They are more likely to be LGB than straight. They are more likely to be transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid. And they are more likely slightly to be foreign-born students. When we look at some of the risk behaviors, so looking at the risk behaviors that are associated with violence, we can see that students with physical disabilities are more likely to be bullied on school property, again, by about a factor of 2. And they're nearly twice as likely to have been forced to have sexual intercourse. They are more likely to have been victims of any kind of sexual violence. And they are about twice as likely to have been victims or to have experienced physical dating violence by someone they were dating or going out with. Looking at mental health and suicidal behaviors, we can see, again, for sadness and hopelessness, students with physical disabilities are somewhat more likely to report sadness and hopelessness. They're substantially more likely to report these suicidal ideation measures like seriously considered suicide or making a suicide plan. But the disparity really leaps out when we look at attempted suicide, and we see that students with physical disabilities are 3 times more likely to have made a suicide attempt within the past year than other students. Alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, we see students with physical disabilities or long-term health problems more likely to be cigarette smokers, more likely to be current marijuana users, and we see that they're twice as likely to be cocaine users and 3 times as likely to be current heroin users. And looking at our resiliency factors, again, we have seen this before, but you can see that for each of the resiliency factors, the students with physical disabilities or long-term health problems are less likely than other students to have this highest level of resiliency factors. And then this is not, the only one this is not really true for is these personal resiliency factors. So making plans to continue education after school and being involved in personal pursuits such as music or sports or something like that. We can look at selected risk factors and their association with the resiliency factors for students with physical disabilities. And we do find that a lot of these protective factors are still very important for students with physical disabilities. So community protective factors are the most strong association that we have for being bullied on school property. You can see this is, it's really these students that are at a very low level of resiliency that have a substantially higher level of being bullied on school property. For physical dating violence, we do see that it's the family protective factors that have the strongest effect for physical dating violence, for protection of physical dating violence. And this is true actually for all groups of students and actually all of the violence indicators. That is really is the family protective factors that do have a strong protective effect for all of the violence, violence-related protective factors for all groups. And they're the only, actually the only protective factor that is protective for all of those questions. For looking at suicide attempts, we see family protective factors, community-related protective factors, and peer-related protective factors. So having a friend who cares about me and who listens to me when I have something to say. These are the 3 types of resiliency factors that are most protective of suicide attempts. And current heroin use, we see the only thing that really is protective at all for current heroin use among students with physical disabilities or long-term health problems is these family protective factors. And you can see that these students who do not have this particular factor, or it's not true that they have these family protective relationships, are very much more likely to be current heroin users than other students. Moving on to sexual identity, our question is, which of the following best describes you? And the responses are heterosexual or straight, gay or lesbian, bisexual, or not sure. This is the same question that's used nationally and by all states that use the YRBS. What we really don't know for sure about the question is what students mean when they say not sure about their sexual identity. But we do know that when they say not sure, their risk profile really resembles very closely the profile of LGB students. So most of the time when they say not sure, what we do is we treat them as if they're questioning in their sexuality, and we do put them together with the LGB students for most things. In our 2021 questionnaire, this will be clarified more, and we'll give people an opportunity to say whether or not they are questioning their sexuality, or, you know, and also an opportunity to say they're not sure if they just don't understand what this means so well. So who are the students that identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual? Well, sexual identity is not associated with most of our normal demographic characteristics, not associated with age, with race, with socioeconomic status or parent education. It's not at all associated with geographic region or rural or urban status, but it is closely associated with sex, and it is closely associated with homelessness. So here, this is looking at sexual identity, our 4 groups that we're looking at with the survey: gay or lesbian, bisexual, not sure, or straight. And we're looking here bi, female, and male. So girls, you can see, are much more likely to report being bisexual than boys. And they are also more likely to report that they're not sure of sexual identity than boys are. And then boys are much more likely to report that they are straight than are girls. We also have a question on the survey that asks about the sex of someone's sexual partners. So what this chart here is saying is that among straight students, 51.6% of them have never had any kind of sexual contact. 46.3% have said that they have had opposite sex partners only. And just less than 1% of straight students say that they've only had sex with people of the same sex, and people, a little over 1% say that they've had sex with people of both sexes. So this really does differ greatly from people who say that they are a gay or lesbian. So the gay or lesbian students are much less likely than straight students to have never had sexual contact. There's still 10.5% of them who say that they have only had sex with members of the opposite sex, and whereas 43% of them do say that they've had same sex only, and both sexes 14.5%. So of those who say that they're gay or lesbian, about a quarter of them have had at some time sex with members of the opposite of sex, either opposite sex only or both sexes. Among bisexual students, 38% said that they had never had sexual contact. 23% have had opposite sex partners only, 7.3% same-sex partners only, and 31% of bisexual students have had sex partners of both sexes. And then students who are not sure of their sexual identity. There's a mix here. So they have about the same prevalence of straight students for never having had sexual contact. A quarter of them have had opposite sex partners only. Same sex partners only 6.6 and 16.3% have had both sex partners. So we can look at homelessness by sexual identity, and you can see that gay or lesbian students or not sure of sexual identity students have 3 times the rate of homelessness as students who are straight. And they also have 3 times the rate of being homeless without their parents than do straight students. Looking at violence-related indicators, LGB or not sure students have almost twice the rate of being bullied on school property. They have higher rates for all of these indicators. So about 3 times the rate of being forced to have sexual intercourse, being any experience of sexual assault, about 3 times the rate, and about 3 times the rate of physical dating violence as well. And then looking at mental health and suicidal behaviors, LGB not sure students have higher rates of sadness or hopelessness, seriously considering suicide, 3 times the rate of making a suicide plan, and 3.5 times the rate of actually making a suicide attempt. So these disparities are really very large for this group. Alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, they have more than twice the rate of cigarette smoking. They have a higher rate of binge drinking by about 1/3. They have higher rate of current marijuana use. They have 3 times the rate of cocaine use, and they have 6.5 times the rate of heroin use. When we look at all of these resiliency factors together for this group, we can see again that for each of these resiliency factors, for in the family, the school, the community, with peers, and with personal resiliency factors, these LGB students do have lower rates of resiliency factors than any of the other, than all other students do have. Looking at which of these protective factors are the most important among this group of students, among sexual minority students again. So if we're looking at bullied at school property and family protective factors, those students who said that it's not true that they have these family related factors are 36% almost said that they were bullied, compared to 27% who said it's pretty true that they have these relationships, and almost 25% of those who said that it's very much true that they have these relationships. So we do see a strong protective effect here. Protective effect is not as strong as for the whole group of students or for straight students, but this is an important and significant relationship. For sexual assault, we have the family protective factors again have a similar relationship. For suicide attempt, we really have 2 groups of protective factors that seem to be very highly protective, family protective factors and community protective factors. And for current heroin use among LGB students, we do see that the family protective factors and the community protective factors and the peer related protective factors are all very important. Moving on to gender identity, our question here is, do you consider yourself transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid? And the responses are, no, I am not transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid. Yes, I am. And I am not sure if I'm transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid, and I don't know what the question is asking. This is a little bit different than the question that's asked nationally and in most states where they just use transgender and they leave off genderqueer and gender fluid. We believed that it was important to kind of cast a wider net and get measure the prevalence of people who do have these gender have kind of a wider identification of gender, their gender identity, than just transgender. A lot of people do not really relate to the word transgender as well. And we do see that the New Mexico prevalence of this is higher than for most other states that use only the term transgender in the question. So we do feel like it's important to add these students. What we don't know, again, is that we don't really know what students mean when they say they're not sure of their gender identity. But what we do know is that those students, again, who say not sure, their risk profile really does resemble those who say that they're transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid. So again, we treat them as if they're questioning their gender identity, and we do include them with transgender students. So here's that breakdown. 3.2% do say they're transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid. 2.8% say that they are not sure, which makes about 6% of the students who do report some kind of gender minority status. So who are these students? Again, gender identity is not associated with most of the regular demographic factors that we look at. It's not associated with race. It's not associated with age, with parent education. It's not associated with geographic region, rural or urban status, and it's not associated with sex. It is very highly associated with homelessness. And you can see that gender minority students are 11 times more likely to be homeless with their parents, and they are 15 times more likely to be homeless without their parents, so homeless on their own, compared to cisgender students. They have higher rates for everything that we look at. So here we're looking at these same bullying or violence-related indicators. They have twice the rate of being bullied on school property, nearly 3 times the rate of being forced to have sexual intercourse, experiencing any kind of sexual assault. They have close to 3 times the rate, and physical dating violence, so not strictly sexual violence, but being hurt physically by somebody they're dating or going out with, they have 3 times the rate compared to cisgender students. Looking at mental health and suicidal behaviors by gender identity, you can see that they have a much higher rate of feeling sad or hopeless, higher rates of both of our suicidal ideation indicators by factors of more than 2 for each of those, and they have 4 times the rate of suicide attempts compared to cisgender students. Looking at alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, we have 3 times the rate of cigarette smoking among gender minority students. We have almost twice the rate of binge drinking, higher rates for current marijuana use, 10 times the rate of current cocaine use, and 22 times the rate of heroin use. So 1% of cisgender students use heroin. Currently, almost 23% of transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid students use heroin. Again, looking at all of these different resiliency factors, you can see that the transgender students have very much lower levels of resiliency than other students do. This is down there again with about the level of the homeless students. So the homeless students and the gender minority students have the lowest levels of the resiliency factors, which means that it might take a lot more work with resiliency factors to see any effect that they have. But we do see effect with the resiliency factors. We see an association, that is, between family protective factors and being sexually assaulted. We see these very strong relationships between the family, protective factors, and the community, protective factors for suicide attempts. And for current heroin use, we see very strong relationships for family protective factors, peer and personal protective factors. So these protective factors are extremely important, but again, we're talking at very high levels of the protective factor. We're only talking about, 10 or 11% of the transgender students have these kind of family-related peer protective factors. So really, that is where we really see these high levels of protection kick in. So it is kind of a stubborn relationship. It's difficult to see it, and it is very important. But it's very important. These relationships are very important for a pretty small group of students. And I'm going to turn this over to Courtney for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, and we're just going to talk very quickly about that group of students that had at least one of those characteristics. So to remind everyone, even though each of those groups is pretty small, proportionately speaking, altogether, when we look at the whole population of New Mexico high school students, 34.5% of our students have at least one of those characteristics. And what we can see is when we look at, for example, the gender identity and current heroin users, so only 6.0% of our students in high school were transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or unsure of their gender identity. But when we look at heroin users, there we go. Almost 60% of our heroin users, the 2.7% of students that were heroin users, almost 60% of those were transgender, genderqueer, or gender fluid. We can see similar patterns when we look at housing status. So only 5.2% of our high school students were homeless, but among our heroin users, it was 62.9% of the students were homeless. So most of our heroin users are homeless students. So if you have interventions for heroin, you want to make sure they're reaching students who are homeless. When we look at high-risk groups and high-intensity binge drinking, we can see that 34.5% of our students had at least one of those characteristics of a high-risk population. When we look at binge drinkers, it's 44% of the students had one of those characteristics. So they're disproportionately represented among binge drinkers. And we look at sexual assault, again, 34.5% of our students have at least one high-risk characteristic, but they make up more than half of the students who've experienced sexual assault. Looking at attempted suicide, again, 34.5% of these students in New Mexico have at least one characteristics, but they make up 62% of the students who have made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. And finally, when we look at heroin users, again, 34.5% of students have at least one of our high-risk group characteristics, but they make up almost 90% of the students that were using heroin. So in summary, we have all 5 of these groups that we've talked about today are at much higher risk for a large range of the risk behaviors that we're interested in with the Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey. Students who are not born in the US, students with physical disabilities or long-term health problems, LGB, and students and those who are unsure of their sexual identity, transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid students, and those unsure of their gender identity, and students who are homeless. And together, these groups make up more than 1/3 of all of our high school students. So it's a large minority, right? Intervention efforts then that are looking at bullying and violence, drug use, alcohol use, tobacco use, basically everything that we're concerned about in public health really need to be inclusive, right? Interventions, for example, that don't include homeless students but for drug use are really missing students who are at very high risk. So our homeless students, for example, make up almost 90%. I'm sorry, not our homeless students. Students who are in any one of these groups make up 90% of all our heroin users. So that's really a high risk behavior, and these students make up a majority of kids that are at that risk. Students in high risk groups are also super less likely than other students to have these protective factors that we measure. They're less likely to have strong relationships with adults in their family and adults at school and adults in the community, as well as with peers. Have those are super protective against some of the risk behaviors that we're looking at with our YRS survey. So they're really, really important, especially for these kids in these marginalized groups. I think that's that for the summary. And the next thing is youthrisk.org. And Dan, I have to go in 1 minute. So will you walk folks through how to access data?
I think we're pretty much at the end of the presentation time. So please go to youthrisk.org if you have any questions about the YRRS. And that's a website where we post our reports and questionnaires and all kinds of information about the survey. And that's it. It's 10:30, so I don't know if we have time to go over some questions or comments or not.
We have one comment in the chat from Anne. Anne says, many thanks, Courtney and Dan. Never easy to address sensitive risk factors and report statistics of those magnitude. And then some other comments are coming in. Thank you and great presentation.
Aw, thank you.
Thank you. Easy questions.
Well, thank you, Dan and Courtney, very much. It was a great presentation, and we really appreciate the information, particularly, of course, to help guide us in our work. So thanks again.
Thank you all for having us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
So our next presentation is going to be from NACA, the Native American Community Academy Prevention Program. And Corey Herrera and Devona Bradford will share their success reaching youth and parents within the Native American community by using social media platforms. They're also going to discuss the implementation of their direct service program, strengthening families. And questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. So welcome, Corey and Devona. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll get started. Oh, sorry. Where's they're sharing for us? Okay. All right.
Would you prefer to share your own screen? Or
no, it's okay. I don't know. I completely forgot I had asked Tanya to share our screen, so that's fine.
We'll go ahead and move through those. Just let us know when you want us to advance.
Sounds good. So thank you so much again for having us. I'm Devona Bradford, and then Corey, as you saw, will be presenting with me. Corey and I will be presenting together. Next slide. So Corey and I both work with the Native American Community Academy, and so we're going to be highlighting 2 of 4 of our strategies. The first one's going to be strengthening families. It's our parent skill building strategy, and so both of our strategies that we're going to be presenting on, I believe, are both of our tribal track strategies. So strengthening NACA families is an evidence-based curriculum which we've culturally modified for Native families at NACA. We've added a lot of different cultural components over the last about 4 years. And so each school year we have 2 cohorts, one in the spring, one in the fall. And we're usually working with only middle school and high school families. Although we won't turn any of the families away if they're interested in joining. And before the pandemic, we were meeting for strengthening families in person. So we would meet once a week in the evenings from about 6 to 8:30. We would provide dinner. That's how we start out. Have a family meal together for about 30 minutes. Let the families mingle, get to know each other, and then we break out into parent sessions and teen sessions for about an hour each. And then come back together about an hour, hour and a half, and then come back together for a family session for the last 30 minutes. And for family sessions, we're usually doing a lot of interactive activities with families where they get to use the skills they're learning in strengthening families. So putting all of those skills to use and just practicing during the family session. But since March of last year, we moved completely to virtual sessions, and we're utilizing Zoom for strengthening family sessions. Recruitment, it's been great for us. We utilize social media for recruitment. We also utilize the school's automated system for phone calls and emails, and send weekly phone calls and emails during the recruitment period, which is usually about 1 to 2 months before the session actually starts. And so we've been pretty successful as far as recruiting. We're going on our 3rd virtual cohort. So we've had 2 other cohorts before this one, which have gone pretty well. And we're actually also implementing Nearpod, which is an interactive lesson tool that the school uses to share educational lessons with students. So we're going to be implementing that with strengthening families and putting some of our lessons onto Nearpod to share with families. One area that's been a little bit of a struggle for us is retaining families during this time, which is understandable. A lot of families have, a lot going on. We noticed that the parents in our cohorts, in previous cohorts, a lot of them are still working outside of the home. They're working non-traditional hours, so some like night shifts. And so that's been one of the areas that we've had a hard time with, but we've had at least one family of all the different cohorts, the 2 cohorts that we've done, we've had at least one family complete and graduate from strengthening families at the end of 7 weeks. So we're currently working with our QI team that we've created to kind of work through some solutions, create some strategies on how we can retain some of those families. And so some of the things that we've come up with is spreading our incentives throughout the 7 weeks, whereas before we were giving incentives at the end. So now we're working on kind of spreading those out throughout the 7 weeks to, keep them interested, keep them coming. And then also the Nearpod lessons is also another solution that we're working on. One of the things that we were having challenges with is if a parent, families can only miss 1 session, and then we schedule a makeup session. So it was getting a little bit too much for facilitators to have to schedule, 3-4 families for makeup sessions. So we're hoping Nearpod is going to help us, where we send the links to Nearpod lessons to the families and they work through the lesson on their own. And then there'll be some kind of assessment at the end where we know that they have the information and are able to apply it to their families. Next slide. So recruitment, this is where we've been really successful. Again, we use social media. NACA, the school, has a Facebook page that we utilize. So we post there weekly, and then families will reach out and we do this little process where we check in with them, make sure they're able to attend all 7 sessions. They have childcare, they have adequate technology at home and internet access that they can, make sure they join us weekly. So we go through a little screening process with them and we get them signed up that way. But this last cohort, most of the way we reached most families was just reaching out to them and calling them directly. We reach out to all the middle school and high school students and go through them one by one, let them know what strengthening families is, ask them if they're able to join, and again, go through that screening process, sign them up that way. The school also has, if you guys are familiar with APS's automated system, they send out emails and phone calls to parents and families. So we use that same system to reach out to families and recruit them that way. In-house referrals has also been successful for us. A lot of the teachers that we work with and our core team really works to gather referrals from any of the students they might be working with and any families they think might benefit from our program. So we also get a few in-house referrals from teachers, advisors, and deans. any student who might have been referred for a substance abuse infraction to the student support office, or maybe teachers know of a student who's having a hard time at home or whose parents might need some extra support, they'll refer them to our program. And so we've had this last parent that graduated shared a lot of how much Strengthening Families has helped her, and one of her students was one of the students that was struggling. So it was good to know that we could provide some support to her. She's a single parent mom with her son, and it was just good to hear how much we could support her with her current situation, especially during this pandemic. But here's our most recent flyer that we shared on Facebook. We're currently recruiting families now for the third cohort, that will start in March, and that will go for 7 weeks. And at the end of 7 weeks, we send them a certificate, they get their incentives. And we go through like a graduation, and now that we can't do that in person, we have a short celebration online and present them with their certificates, which has been nice. So I'm going to pass it over to Corey. Corey's going to finish off with our positive knock-in norms strategy.
All right. Can you guys hear me? My volume okay? All right, cool. Thank you, Devona. Devona is out in the hills because that's where she gets a better internet connection. Just kidding. So my name is Corey Herrera. I am working with NACA. I still have that fresh car smell. I just started working here and I like this, it's really nice to work with natives again. If you can change the next slide. Okay, these are all incentives. These are incentives for me to do a good job. I'm just kidding. No, these are the incentives that we would have for strengthening families. As you can see, the pre-pandemic, they had Hinkle Family Fund Center. And we had to get creative with our incentives during this pandemic. So you change the food boxes, personal protective equipment, disinfectants, and fishing passes. Pretty sick. Okay, move on to the next slide, please. All right, here's my section. So I'll be talking to you a little bit about positive knock-in norms. So this is our strategy in OSAP. Our goal is to reduce underage drinking students in 6th through 12th grade. And the way we do that is with our positive knock-in norms. So what is positive knock-in norms? It's process-based messaging on community transformative community message modeling. Yeah, that's a lot. So basically, it's a strength-based approach to our messaging is how we do it. Our goal is to help NACA community create substance abuse prevention messaging through posters, art, social media posts that shows the strengths in our community and highlights examples of resiliency. And it goes and get away from fear-based approaches. And for us, I think like that's a really important thing that working with Native populations, because we see that in my experience working with Native providers, they don't really respond well to data or, fears, or if you cite laws to them that this is what's going to happen, so we try to personalize each message that we give and highlight strengths. And with our Native culture, there's such a well of information, and it's just like that's probably like one of the biggest areas where we get our strength-based approaches from, is just our own culture. And you'll see examples of that in the next few slides with our messaging. If you go ahead and do the next slide, please. So with our positive knock-in norms PNN messaging, it's geared toward our NACA community. We utilize input from our students. So every message that's created through the PNN, we bring to the students, we gather their input, and we get their ideas and their suggestions, and oftentimes we'll also get quotes from them. So you can see this slide here. We got some quotes from the high school students. And one thing that we notice when we do messaging like this is that we get a huge response from our NACA community. And we see that when people share it on Facebook, they like it, and I'll tag other people in it. And again, it is strength-based approach. I don't think like, I don't know. I just think personally, like as a prevention specialist, I was kind of reflecting on it. I've been in prevention for like 10 years, man. I didn't even notice that till just now. But one thing that does echo is like when you take a fear-based approach, when working with Native communities, it doesn't really go far, you know. And when you say that we're going to have a presentation on data, you know, a lot of tribal populations will kind of gear away towards that because they feel like you're trying to pitch them something, you know. So we try to like personalize the data by using, you know, actual quotes from like this one here, like quotes from the students or quotes from leaders in the community, you know. And we try to make sure that all of our PNN messaging highlights Native culture, you know, and create positive messaging. So go ahead and do the next slide. Let's see. All right, so the way that we develop it, talked a little bit about it already, is that we do meet with the students and we gather their input. What I do is I like to draft designs and then bring it back to the youth because they'll give you an honest opinion if they like it or not, and I'm down with that, you know. And after we get the we get a draft, we'll submit it to our NACA governing board, and then they will give us feedback, you know, if we need to realign it, if there's some messaging, you know, they'll give us their feedback. And then if we do have edits, then we'll make those edits and then we'll send it back for approval. And then once that is done, then we can submit it to post on our Facebook page. So one thing that we've done this year that's been really successful is I know we created messaging in the past where we can distribute it, you know, but this year, of course, with the COVID-19 stuff, we've had to go 100% online, you know, and that's been successful. We've had a lot of people viewing our positive knock-on-door messaging and sharing it on Facebook. Go and switch to the next slide. All right, here we go. And as you can see, these are the one on the left, the one that has healthy coping skills. That one was one of our most successful ones. It got shared at least 30 or 40 different times and had like 3,000 or 4,000 people see it. So that was really cool. But this is one that we developed with our youth. You know, we facilitated discussion with them, you know, and checked in with them and asked how they cope with the stress. And these are some of the things that they came up with. And again, we use a lot of Native, we use our Native knowledge in creating these graphics, you know, because it brings an extra layer of like, I don't know, it feels more personal. I feel like people take it a lot more personal and means more, something to them more when you use like Native messaging and Native knowledge bases. So I kind of bring my Pueblo perspective to it because, you know, I'm from the Pueblo and that's what I know, you know. But go ahead and do the next slide. And these are just more examples of our messaging. Let me see.
Do you mind if I jump in really quick?
Jump in.
I think one of the areas that we really wanted to focus on with PNN since the pandemic started was coping. You know, just healthy coping and reminding students there are a lot of different ways, because I think at the beginning, just speaking from like the parents' perspective, knowing a lot of the kids and students that my own teenagers were hanging out with, they're kind of struggling, right? Even the students who were doing well in school before the pandemic, those kids were struggling. So just really reminding students, you know, there's a lot of different ways that we can cope, but also, you know, my husband teaches the personal wellness class, and coping, healthy coping and different styles of coping is a huge component with in his curriculum. So he's talking about coping in his class. So students at NACA know, you know, they're learning about healthy and unhealthy coping. So that's really what we wanted to focus on for positive NACA norms since the pandemic started, was how do we remind students that you know, there's going to be all these different stressors, especially right now, right? There's so many different layers right now. Everyone's in the home. everyone's schedules, everyone's frustrated with one another, but how do we remind students that, to tap into their healthy coping techniques, whether it be even if you're having family dinner together at the table at once, or going for family walks, or music, or skateboarding, all the different hobbies, utilizing those and applying all those right now this is like a great time to apply all those and make sure we're coping in a healthy way, and not and recognizing also like what is unhealthy coping, right? So I think that's really what, if you look at all the different messages that we've shared, what we've really tried to focus on was just reminding our students that, we need to cope in a healthy way and supporting them through that.
Awesome. I think that's about it, unless you want us to talk about how we, is there anything else that we need to mention?
And then we just also wanted to share, Corey mentioned, he's new to the program. He started, I believe, at the beginning of this school year, but before he started, Maggie Seawright, was also part of NACA-SAPO, had transitioned out when Corey was coming in, but she's also contributed to these messages, beautiful messages and she's worked closely with our students to get quotes from them about how they're coping at home. And so this one on the left these are actually my 3 teens right here on the left. And so she reached out, asked them how they're doing during this time, how they're coping, what they really look forward to during the day. And so these were some quotes that they shared. And so Maggie's been really great at using Canva. She utilizes Canva to create these beautiful messages. So we just want to give a shout out to Maggie. And thank her for her work at NACA and creating these beautiful messages for us before she left NACA.
Definitely. And like when I first started, like that was my main thing, is like I wanted to make sure to keep the standard up, you know what I mean? Because she did such a great job. So yeah, definitely big shout out to Maggie. I think that's about it, unless you want to take some questions.
Of our presentation, and we wanted to give a little bit of time at the end to make sure we had time for questions.
Well, that was really gorgeous artwork. There's a lot of comments in the chat about what beautiful images and how warm and engaging they are. So folks are very appreciative of that. Does anybody have any questions?
The one that blinked, Mama. You're the one who blinked. No?
Andrea, do you have any questions from folks?
I don't see any questions in the chat. There are no raised hands, but lots of praise certainly in the chat box here if you all want to read some of those comments. I actually have a question for you both about engaging with youth to help develop some of these messages. Would you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. So I have a group that meets regularly Monday and Thursday. And we usually meet for it's at the end of the day when school's all done for them, so I try not to put too much on their plate because a lot of the kids are feeling Zoom fatigue. So I try to keep it positive, and I have skills. I used to do project ventures, so I know how to facilitate discussions with youth. So I know how to make it fun. I'll start with some icebreakers, and get the youth to tell me how they're feeling, and then I'll share my screen and just show the ideas of what I have, and then get them to comment, on, okay, what are some messaging that you can, that we can get from this image? What are some healthy coping strategies? What are some things, and we'll just have a discussion. We'll talk with the kids, and I'll write notes down, and I think they respond really well because they see that we're actually listening and we use what they say on the messaging. So it's not like it's not like oh, maybe we'll use that. It's like, no, we're going to use it, and I think they really like that. And I like working with kids anyway, and I'm good with working with kids, especially Native kids. There's just this special thing that happens when working with Native people, so Another thing that we never really touch on that would be something to discuss is like, I think humor in Native communities is the biggest icebreaker that we do have. And if you saw in one of the messaging I put at the end of it, when you're feeling all somehow, remember you're something else, you know? And you can kind of imagine like someone saying that, you know, and it puts a funny image in your head while it's still being positive. You know what I mean? But yeah, anything you want to chime in, Devona?
Yeah, I think with the coping, I think what Maggie utilized as far as like just reaching out to students and asking them again, you know, how are you coping? What is a healthy way that you're coping? And that's where a lot of those like beautiful images came in with the music, the skateboarding, the going for family walks. And again, just Canva. Canva's a really great tool. I don't know how many of our programs use Canva, but it's a great tool to create these kind of messages. And then also, I think you can also create presentations on there. But yeah, utilize Canva. It's a great tool out there that's available. Thank you. Any other questions?
Let's see.
I just
love hearing about strength-based approaches that were also important with NW, Indigenous Communities. NW, what is that?
Northwest?
Northwest.
Oh, Northwest.
Okay. Oh, okay, cool.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing the Canva.
Yeah, Canva's awesome, dude. Like, definitely use it. There's like so much stuff in there. It's also like, if you're thinking of creating a logo for your like prevention or coalition program, like they have templates for logos and stuff. So like what I use is I just take the stuff that I need for my program, and then I'll, you know, I use a lot of my own knowledge base in terms of like my own culture. So like if you saw, all the themes that I create have like our sacred colors for directions. For Cochiti, that's yellow, blue, red, and white. But for Dene people, it's different, as well as it is for a bunch of other natives. And one thing I love about Naka is we have so much diversity when it comes to native people. So we have to tap into that. Sorry, but my kids are all at the same time.
So I think that wraps it up for us.
Oh, thank you both. We do have a raised hand. So Tanya, a question, and Tanya, you should be all set.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Corey and Devona, for a beautiful presentation. I have so many questions, and I wish I could ask them all, but I think it's also kind of like a piggyback question off Andrea's about engaging youth, but more so on the community leaders. Like, how do you recruit those community leaders? Are they like within the Naka community? And do you ever have like, you know, some conversations with the elder our tribal leaders and youth at the same time to help create those content that you put on social media?
So we haven't worked directly with like tribal elders, but we do work with a lot of the leaders, especially the ones working directly with youth at Naka. For example, we have a youth mentorship program, the Naka Hiopo Alliance. We work closely with them, and they've also offered a lot of the skills they have to help us with our messaging as far as like videography, those kind of things. But yeah, so a lot of the leaders that we are working with are within like the Naka community. Who else, Corey? Is there anyone else that we worked with as far as like PNN? But that is a great, thank you for bringing that up, because I think because of COVID, we haven't really worked much outside of the Naka community, like with elders and tribal leaders. And I think that's a great, you know, that's a great thing that we should be doing. I'm hoping we can do some of that. I didn't even think about that. I think we've all just been in like survival mode since the pandemic started, right? Just trying to figure out how to keep our families engaged. Also like Corey and I are both parents, so just like, you know, with all the other things that we're trying to take care of at home with being teachers and so many different
Teaching
things like
math.
everyone else, right? But thank you for bringing that up. That's a great question.
I think like we utilize a lot of the people at NACA, and that is kind of our community that we go through. I totally lost my train of thought. My kid was doing something that they shouldn't be doing. But no, that's definitely one thing that we need to utilize more. And like Devona said, I think because of the pandemic, it's kind of inhibited a little bit of our discussions with the community. And like me, I'm more social around Native people, you know, and I feel like that's when we'll be able to like create more messaging and, you know, get more input. But right now we just have to settle for, you know, for Zoom and what's going on Zoom. But no, that's a great question.
And then also, like Cindy mentioned, Cindy evaluator, but PNN is really focused on using and also with the students and also just NACA community overall, but that's really what PNN is focused on. So that's where most of our information comes from. But we have thought about in the past working with artists from the community to help us develop messaging. So that's one component that we're hopefully we'll start doing in the future. But yeah, that PNN is really focused on the NACA community, the data that comes from within the school. And that's usually from like YRS, but then also we have NACA community survey that we do and collect our own data. So we use a lot of that data for PNN messaging also. But I think we're right on time. We've used up all our time, but thank you all so much. Thank you for all your comments. And again, thank you for having us present today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. We really appreciate your presentation, particularly all the work that you're doing during COVID-19. We know it's really difficult and you've done a really good job. So thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you guys.
So folks, we're going to take a break now, and please do plan on reconvening back again at 11:15. Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. At this time, our OSAP program manager, Heather Burnham, is going to talk to you about billing. Take it away, Heather.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. As Karen said, my name is Heather Burnham, and I'm a program manager with OSAP, and I seem to have a lot of activity and attention towards STAR and billing issues. So that's what I'm going to cover with you today. And I wanted to cover some basics that I haven't talked about in a number of years. So if you've been around long enough, these slides should look incredibly familiar. But we are starting a new cohort of PFS 20, and there have been enough staff turnover and review and re-articulation of the basics is always a good reminder. I think that I have more material than my time slot will allow, but at least you will have the slides, and you're more than welcome to give me a call or shoot me an email if you want to go over any of the particular slides, or given that I have more material than I have time to cover, I talk really fast. So if you were in the middle of writing something down and then I've already moved on and you didn't finish what that thought was and putting in your notes, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So as you'll notice, we have slides that are pretty standardized for human services, and it's worth articulating how what I'm going to present to you adheres not only to our mission, but the goals. So I think we can all agree that what substance abuse prevention does and helps to do is helps to transform lives. So by working with you all, we are creating and delivering the best content and services that we possibly can. So particularly, we focus on helping New Mexicans and trying to make access easier. And I would say, while normally I focus more on the first and third goals, the left-hand side, I would say today, given that we're doing a conference, that we're hoping to provide effective, transparent communication with not only the public, but with you all. And hopefully this is a form of support where I can articulate where we have boundaries, where we have to adhere to certain policies, and being able to articulate that to you all, it will hopefully articulate the trust and respect that I have with all of you, and hopefully keep that open so I can be true to what's happening and why I can or can't allow something. So here's an example of everything that I'm hoping to cover. I want to talk about some contractual items. I want to talk about STAR logistics, and then get into kind of what the OSAP specific kind of budgets aspects are, how to document costs, and if I do have any spare moments, I want to talk about bundling and SPIF versus strategies, but you guys are pretty great on those, so I'm just hitting on it as a nice reminder for those that aren't as familiar. So let's dive into it. So audits used to happen from Optum Health as our administrative service organization. And then I want to say 4 to 5 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark, we switched over to Falling Colors as the administrative service organization. Well, in all of those transfers and transitions, there was some nomenclature changes, and ultimately, if you've been around in the OSAP system long enough, you remember Optum Health used to do site visits and check off things with a rubric. And then when we've now moved to Falling Colors, that's not actually happening anymore. So to speak to audits, there's an audit that's done by a CPA, for example. Those are an annual requirement. They're included in your scope of work. There's a discussion of it, particularly in the last couple of pages. And I wanted to articulate that when we first did scopes of work for this current state fiscal year 21, it may have, the email address to send the audit to said support@fallingcolors.com or support@bhsdstar.org. Either of those will work, but There's been some clarification with our finance department, and really all of those reports, while they were being sent to Falling Colors, ended up being collected by our BHSD finance team. So once we finished scopes of work back in March through June, they actually changed the template to say, just send it straight to us. So given here we are, I would want to articulate that bhsd.financeteam@state.nm.us is where all of the annual audit will be sent to and will be compiled at. And I've gotten a lot of hesitation from providers about, well, I don't do my audits on a state fiscal year system. So you can do a calendar year instead of the state fiscal year of July through June. But I think it is likely we have a really responsive leadership team where we might be in the next year or two, certainly getting back to doing site visits and hopefully being able to have the resources necessary to be able to do that sans a COVID environment. So it's really important that you guys continue to do really good financial record keeping. That's always a smart plan, but particularly because we will be coming back to the site visit issue and you've got annual audits. It's just really good to have a solid documenting system that speaks to what you're doing financially. So here are the basics about your contractual items. We are required to have cost reimbursement mechanisms within all of our contracts, and that's because it's a state law. It's the procurement code, and there's this particular area of the procurement code it relates to, and particularly payment. We are paying you for what you're purchasing, which includes staff time and things of that nature. So that would also reiterate down to your subcontracts that we mandate happen with your evaluators. Those should be reflective of the activity that's happening. So you are paying for a particular service, not just we pay a particular amount every month. Now, I completely understand how important it is that there's a regular funding stream for just about everybody. So maybe that's a conversation with your evaluator on what activity do you want to be doing on a regular basis? How many hours do you want to meet for, and what do you want to do to fill those hours? Because evaluators are incredible experts, and I'm really excited and happy to be working for a place that encourages a subcontract with a local evaluator. But we have to adhere to procurement code. And ideally, this also is a BHSD aspect. We want them to be billing every month so that there's a monthly activity that you are then entering in within the next 30 days, so that it isn't a quarterly huge bump when you're paying out your evaluator. There are very limited exceptions to this procurement code, and those are things that realistically you can't purchase and then bill for. So you have to purchase for example, a magazine subscription. You purchase a year of getting that magazine ahead of time. Similarly with advertising, you don't pay after it's already happened, you pay before. Airlines would be another great example. I do have the caveat that you need to have a conversation with us. It's a request to do out-of-state travel. We have hoops we have to jump through, and occasionally, depending on the legislature, it goes up to the governor's office to permit out-of-state travel. And another example are conference fees. So another example of a thing that we need to cover is that costs have to remain ideally within a state fiscal year. So your contract has a certain amount of allocation that needs to be spent between July 1st and June 30th. So for example, this is really relevant when we're talking end of state fiscal year. So we're heading into June and we're almost transferring over into July. You want to wrap up all of your possible billing. I know some organizations allow credit cards or purchase cards, P-card usage, but those are like credit cards, meaning while you bought it, you're not actually paying the bill for it until later. So some organizations limit your ability to use those cards by the time you get into late May into early June, so that all of those things you purchased have time to be collected and billed for. So typically you can't have something that you purchase in June and that you pay for in July with this current contract. Because when you've paid for it, that's when the activity actually hit your ledger. So if you get a bill, you need to hurry and pay for it so that it becomes a June activity and you enter it with the final billing. Usually that last billing system happens July 15th, but our finance department would absolutely, we would all be ecstatic to have you guys be able to bill earlier. I know that's, you're closing out at the end of a fiscal year, but that really helps us close our books and doesn't delay or exaggerate how long closing our own state fiscal year books take in time. So typically money doesn't, there isn't a relationship between money from one state fiscal year into another state fiscal year. Hence why we have a closing of a book and an opening of a new fiscal year. However, there is some exceptions, aren't there always? And if this happens more with discretionary grants, but sometimes we did this with COVID. We understand that spending might be lower this year. And so we can give you the opportunity for a carry forward, and we'll be reaching out and just know that this is an exception to the money doesn't roll over from one fiscal year to the other. And the way that we work that bureaucratically is that we'll take that money, literally, we'll take it out of your allocation in STAR and we will add it to your contract for the next fiscal year, if that's a possibility. And that's because we get federal grants. So the grant is actually happening between a federal fiscal year, which is different than a state fiscal year. Usually the terms with that is that if you do have carry forward, it needs to be spent by the end of the federal fiscal year. So if you did have an extra $5,000 that we did in a carry forward, you wouldn't be able to spend that for the entire next state fiscal year. I hope I haven't confused you, but know that overall money doesn't roll over from one fiscal year to another. Okay, dates. All billing must be entered and on an invoice within 30 days after the end of a month. Meaning, so if you had costs for January, they all need to be entered and in STAR by the end of February. It would be ideal and it would line up with your supporting documentation if you use the date that you paid a subcontractor after they invoice you, or you use the date that you cut paychecks, because that's when the cost you are, the organization is incurring the cost of that subcontractor or that paycheck. So as an example, you might have an event on July 30th. You may receive an invoice and pay it on August 15th. So when you're paying for it, that's when your organization incurred the expense. So it would be an August expense, even though the event happened in July. So ideally, the way that we can make your supporting documentation tighter for relating a cost with what you put in STAR is if you use the date or the date range that relates to what you're billing for. So if you are cutting paychecks, you are then putting those salaries in STAR using those dates that you cut those paychecks. And that makes it a tighter relationship between what the cost is and when you incurred it. So rather than saying, well, this is, I'm in STAR, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to say it's the first of, for all of my costs, it's the first of the month is the date I'm going to use, or the last day of the month. That doesn't relate very tightly, and it's not actually descriptive of what you're doing. So rather than say the first or the last day, or I've also seen a date range for the entire month for every cost. Like, not only am I billing for January costs, but I'm going to put in the date range January 1st through January 31st. Well, that's not really accurate if you're talking about paychecks. You're talking about the an actual date that this happened. And I would prefer to see the actual date. That makes it more accurate. So, STAR logistics. Invoices generate at midnight on the 15th and the last day of the month. So that means me as a program manager can begin to review invoices on the 1st and the 16th. It is worth noting that while most people wait until after the month has occurred to then enter their billing, if you are a really small organization, you can actually bill during the month. So we are now past the 15th of February, so you could even enter February costs now. The billing window allows you to enter for the month you're currently in or the month that happened within the last 30 days. But I understand there's also a lot of you are county kind of governments or institutions that are large enough that you have a monthly budget reconciliation every month. So you won't even have all of your information till a couple of days after. I have a question from Joanna. So for staff invoices, then if we pay them on the last day of the month, we can charge their whole salary for the date the check was cut and not itemized. Okay. It depends, yes, as far as dates are concerned. If you only paid somebody once a month and it was at the end of the month for the entire date range or for the entire month, yes, you'd have that one date. But I wouldn't say you can't itemize or you wouldn't need to itemize because unless that individual is only working on one strategy for the whole month with only one population, you need to break it down to be able to say they were spending this much of their time on this strategy and with these groups. But I can, you can't pick multiple strategies or multiple populations, strategies. So yes, you can pick multiple strategies. There is within STAR the ability to say a percentage of their time was spent on this strategy or this strategy. Where we get into, no worries, where we get into the issue as far as the data we collect is if you say they worked with all these different populations over the course of the month, the data on our end looks like all of those people were in one big room with your staff person for the entire month. And ideally, we want to report accurate data. So unfortunately, more line items would be ideal so that we get good data to report to Congress. Okay, so if corrections are needed on your invoice, this is something many of you may not have encountered before. But if I say, or say you were in a hurry and you didn't include supporting documentation, I will put your invoice up for corrections. And it's a drop-down option for me that says it requires corrections. I usually highlight all of the activity that you put all of those line items so that those become things you can interact with and edit or delete. But say you just needed to add supporting documentation, I'll still highlight all of the things. But then it becomes, once I hit submit, it goes back to you and goes into that icon that says corrections are required or needed. And it's usually an orange circle with a big exclamation point. So then it becomes an invoice that I can't interact with. It's something only you can handle. So I can't right now in STAR have the ability to pull that invoice back myself, which means as soon as I submit it to you, I need you guys to be able to do something with that invoice. And relatedly, what happened in the past is that providers wouldn't interact with the invoice, and maybe they don't go into STAR regularly, or they're not looking at that icon. But invoices that needed correction would just sit there. So my finance department worked with STAR and created this automatic denial. So if that invoice sits in the area of corrections needed for longer than 30 days, STAR will automatically deny your invoice. So I've also had the case where I've had providers enter all the changes, or they added the supporting documentation, but they didn't choose corrections completed from the drop-down options, which would then regenerate the invoice and send it back to me. So because they didn't hit the corrections completed and they didn't finish what they were doing in corrections completed, the system also denied the invoice. So if you have a correction that is opened up back for you to correct something, you have 30 days to enter those changes, and you've got to select corrections completed from the drop-down menu. Okay, back billing requests. say you missed the 30-day window, or you realize 2 months down the line that you completely forgot to include an invoice that you paid for over here. It's not something you normally deal with all of your billing. And you realize that you need to request reimbursement for an expense from months in the past, or really beyond the 30-day window. So you're going to have to fill out a request to open the billing window. That form is located at bhsdstar.org. There are tabs at the top, so you need to choose under manuals and guides. There's a little box in the top left that says commonly used forms, and you should be able to pull it right from there. You will send that form to your program manager and say, I will approve it because you sent me an email, let me know what's going on. You include that form. I can write my approval on it and send it internally. But know that part of that internal review is that our Deputy Director of Finance has to actively approve it, because it's Falling Colors has to spend manual time to change the date range for your organization. So because this is a manual change, it's time that Falling Colors bills to the state for what they're doing. So my finance leadership has the right and the ability to deny that request, meaning you can't recoup your expenses. So I just want you to know that while usually it goes through without a problem, then there is the possibility that if, for whatever the situation was, that my Deputy Director of Finance can deny the request to open the billing window. So we had a question from Kimberly that Karen answered. Kimberly asked, has there been any update on notification via email? I wish, as to when a correction is needed, or do we have to continue checking STAR? So there is, as Karen says, there is not an email notification. I do recommend that you check STAR pretty regularly, but there's, I also have been trying to acknowledge and send an email that like, hey, I'm opening up your invoice for corrections, but we're human and we might miss that in our inbox. I know I miss plenty of things in my inbox regularly. So yes, I would recommend checking STAR as a good double check. Okay, so when you're in the back billing request and my Deputy Director of Finance has approved your request, usually they CC the provider and Karen and myself and the OSAP team when they send an email to Falling Colors saying, this is okay, please open this billing window. That doesn't mean that your billing window has been opened yet. It means that my finance has directed STAR to open it. So if you were to jump at that email and go into STAR immediately and try to do your back billing, you're still going to reach the error message. So you need to wait. Usually it's within the same day, but Falling Colors will specifically email you and usually CC all of us that yes, in fact, the back billing window has been opened. You should be good to go. Unlike corrections completed, where you have 30 days, for back billing requests, you have till the end of the month to enter your costs. And unfortunately, what happened for one provider in the last month was it was the last working day of that month when she got the back billing window open, meaning she really had that day to enter what she needed to. But luckily, you know, I was talking to her about it. I prepped her to know that like, you gotta jump on it, because unfortunately that window is going to close at the end of the month. It is not a 30-day option. Okay, redundancy. This goes back to using really good dates, because when you are putting something into STAR, it affixes your name to that item, meaning you are affirming, and it's probably in the small print located somewhere, because it used to be something you had to actively acknowledge, but they've taken that away as another thing that to have to click. But you're affirming that what you're putting in there, those costs are accurate, and that you have supporting documentation for those costs. So it becomes imperative that you have your own account, because otherwise you are assigning someone else's name to those costs and that they have documentation, which is fraudulent. So I would recommend, you can always reach out to Falling Colors or one of your program managers, and we can get a list of all of your active STAR users. We can help you fill out the form to become a new user, but I would use your account and don't have an understanding in your organization that everybody just uses the same account. Okay, similarly, having at least 2 people registered in STAR and understanding how to bill ensures that you're not going to miss the billing window, you're not going to have to deal with back billing requests, and that you will capture the costs that you need to within that 30 days after the end of the month window. Similarly, it's really useful for those more, for the number of STAR users you have in STAR, to have one programmatic person that really understands what you're doing with your strategies on a day-to-day basis. They should be the one I would recommend that enters your STAR billing. And then you have a senior person review what's entered in STAR. At the very least, make sure that you have a monthly list that speaks to, this is my total, and I want the totals to match. That would be at least one thing to look at. And it's useful if you are like the program director, that you're at least overseeing and familiar with what STAR looks like. So relatedly, if you don't want to be the one to enter things in STAR, you could get a STAR account with just read-only access. Or say you're the program director and you want the finance person to look at it, but you don't want them to actually be entering things on behalf of your OSAP program, there is the option for read-only access. Okay, similarly, just as add another log to the fire in redundancy, it's really important that you have some sort of written policy on how you put costs together, so that you know to include all of the pay periods in that month. You know to include the credit card statements as well, and also how you track your personal time. And I have a number of different Excel, I'm collecting them, Excel examples on how to automate your time, how to get formulas to be able to make life a little bit easier. But acknowledge that you have an Excel spreadsheet that helps you do it. What your tools are and who you get certain paperwork from. When do you get it in a month? Things like that. And that's because turnover is inevitable, because I imagine all of you will be winning the lottery, marrying rich, or retiring young. So it's really imperative that to keep substance abuse prevention happening in your county, that you can pay for it and get reimbursed for it. So have some documentation to how you do things. Yeah, basically you want the next person that takes on this task to know how to bill and to how to document, and really also to how to understand your notes and documentation. So if you went back 2 years into, however your previous person did billing, they have to understand what your notes are on how they did things. Because if something errant comes up in that audit, you want to be able to explain what it was and to not owe the state money because you can't find that receipt or something of that regard. Okay, OSAP items, and I have like a minute. Allowable and unallowable. So it's important and unusual, I would say. So include your finance staff to know that we allow things most grants don't, which is including small incentives for data collection and food, and this is an important phrase, that is integral to the success of a meeting. But we do have some unallowables, and this is also kind of OSAP specific. Within HSD, we have an IT policy that doesn't let you purchase computers or software or most computer related equipment. And we're trying to get an update on that policy, but in reality, that's just, we can't go there. It doesn't even matter how small of an amount it is. Similarly, because we are federally funded, we cannot directly fund law enforcement time. So unlike the DWI program, we can't use our funds, and we can't let you use OSAP funds to fund law enforcement time. You can't buy big furniture, and you can't buy promotional items. And I think that's where I'm going to have to stop. But if you guys, if there's anything in the following areas that surprise you, and you want to talk about it, or if anything here has been surprising or alarming, feel free to let me know, and we will figure out some solutions. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you, Heather. And I hope that by now everybody has Heather's contact information if you have any questions for her. We do have one question I see in the chat, and oops, a bunch of people are answering it. They were asking what COSA means,
Right.
And that's Children of Substance Abuse.
Yep.
So,
yeah, I see Anne's comment that the protocol says you can buy iPads. I think they were speaking more generally that like your organization could certainly buy iPads. They can't be purchased with OSAP dollars. And I'm glad that you brought that up and that we can mention that difference. I also have a question from Paula Feathers. Can you clarify the difference between incentives and promotion? Absolutely, and I have the page from our discretionary grants where this is a SAMHSA directive, and it refers to pens, pencils, hats, cups. Those are promotional items that typically people will slap on a logo. That's not going to change behavior, so they're not allowing us to let you guys purchase promotional items. Incentives, it depends on what we're talking about specifically. But the incentives can be, for example, like with the community survey, $2.50 per person, or if you're doing a focus group, you can have, I think there's, depending on the focus group, we would talk about rates, but that could be anywhere from $10 to $20, something in that ballpark. But when we're talking amounts, we're not talking things. So I've also seen like a granola bar or water, they're not promotional items with a logo on them. Okay, thanks. Thanks
you,
so much, everybody.
Heather. And Heather, would you mind placing your contact information into the chat so that
Absolutely.
people, if by any chance, it's hard to believe, but somebody may not know your contact information by now, and this way they'd at least have it.
Absolutely.
So, that would be great. Thanks so much. Good
Thank you.
information. We appreciate it. So our next speakers come from the Albuquerque office of the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation. And their presentation was recommended by the colleagues that we work with from PIRE, which is Liz Lilliot and Ashley Simmons Rudolph. And Daniel Shattuck is going to join us today. I believe he has a colleague with him that he was going to introduce. And they're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on sexual and gender minority youth well-being. And we've asked that questions will be taken at the end. So please welcome Daniel. And it looks like, I believe, Alena.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today. My name is Daniel Shattuck. I'm an associate research scientist at the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation, the Southwest Center located in Albuquerque. I'm a public health researcher, implementation scientist / anthropologist, and I'll have Alena introduce herself.
I am also at the Southwest Center at PIRE. I'm a graduate student at UNM in sociology.
So we're here today to talk about our work looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the well-being of sexual and gender minority youth in New Mexico. Just to give you a little bit of background, if you haven't heard of PIRE, which I assume most people may have working with Liz and Ashley, PIRE is an independent nonprofit organization, and our goal is to merge scientific knowledge with proven practice to create solutions that basically improve things for our communities. The work that I'll talk about today is supported by a PIRE corporate development grant, one of our internal funding structures. I'm the PI along with Dr. Lara Gunderson in our center. And it was also supported in part by a grant from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. The PIs for that are Katie Wilgeen and Mary Ramos. And I just have a little note here on some of the abbreviations that you'll see throughout. SGM is used to abbreviate sexual and gender minority, and then LGBTQ+ is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning, and we add the plus to be inclusive of all the other different terms that are not included in that acronym itself. So a little bit of background. This work that I'll talk about was kind of inspired by this larger project that we've been working on. It's a 5-year cluster randomized controlled trial called Implementing School-Based Strategies to Reduce LGBTQ+ Adolescent Suicide, or RLAS for short, because we love a good acronym. And the study is focused on the use of implementation science to implement and scale up evidence-based practices in secondary schools across New Mexico to create safer and more supportive environments for LGBTQ+ youth, with the expressed goal of reducing suicidality and other risk behaviors like substance use among that population, as well as their cisgender and straight peers. For those of you that may be unfamiliar with what implementation science is, it's the science of how to get people to do the thing. So you have an evidence-based practice or evidence-informed practice that you want to put in place somewhere in an institutionalized setting, in a community. Implementation science is the body of knowledge that helps us do that in a systematic way. And for anyone that goes and looks at this presentation a little bit later, I've included some links to select publications there if you'd like to read more specifically about RLAS. But our implementation and health outcomes for that study are still pending analysis, and hopefully we'll be able to start presenting those in the coming months. And so, like I'm sure that you are all aware, New Mexico was pulled into this pandemic last March 2020. And at that time, for the RLAS study, we were going through our spring kind of segment of data collection, so interviews and focus groups with school staff in our participating schools across the state. And in the midst of that, schools were shut for on-site learning. And while we were speaking with school staff, none of this will be a surprise to any of you, I'm sure. We found that folks were juggling childcare and education demands at home. The move to online learning really created new time and labor demands that were well outside of the quote-unquote normal work demands. Some of our participants were fulfilling broader needs in the communities, so we worked with a lot of folks who suddenly were delivering food to families, getting medical supplies out to their communities. And so these folks that were already stressed and really stretched thin can't really serve as kind of the front line of recognizing and responding to signs of risk or mental distress that students might be expressing in the same way as they would be if they were physically together in a school environment. Added to that, people were noticing much lower parental engagement for reasons I'm sure are probably obvious to everyone on this call. And then folks were really unsure as to what types of resources were still available, since a lot of the physical locations that they would normally send folks had shifted. They weren't sure what services were provided virtually, and a lot of our community organizations were in the process of pivoting themselves, so they weren't super sure about what kinds of services they'd still be able to provide. And so our research partners, community organizations, and the school staff that we worked with really feared the negative implications of the pandemic and the associated social distancing measures that were imperative to kind of stopping the spread or slowing the spread for already marginalized or high-risk populations like sexual and gender minority youth. And from this morning with Dan and Courtney, you saw some of these risk factors or these behaviors that they're at higher risk for. And so we were really worried about kind of decreases in positive interactions, so being pulled away from school or peer-based supports, the sources of resiliency that are really important for youth, but in particular sexual and gender minority youth. We were worried about increases in negative interactions, so being trapped at home in a non-supportive environment at best, and in a dangerous environment at worst. And then the added economic strain, housing instability, and food insecurity that we know that these populations are already at risk for. And at that time, the systems for collecting real-time data on the impacts of the pandemic were fairly limited. We know that the YRS is every other year, which is kind of our large-scale surveillance system for youth in New Mexico. So 2019 and 2021, the height of what was going on with the pandemic is kind of in that 2020 range, right? Excuse me. And so we started up the Supporting at-Home Sexual and Gender Minority Youth Study, or lovingly called SASSY. Like I said, we love a good acronym. And we conducted this during the summer and early fall of 2020 to assess the impact of the ongoing COVID pandemic and associated public health guidelines on SGM youth's mental health and substance use. It comprised of a quantitative survey with SGM youth in New Mexico and qualitative interviews with youth, family members, behavioral health providers, and school-based professionals. And we did all of this in partnership with the New Mexico Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network and the Mountain Center. They were really helpful in getting our survey out to folks through their various communication channels. So like social media, their email listservs, those types of things. And after the first couple weeks of slow going with getting responses, based on the suggestion of one of our interviewees, actually, we switched over to some paid advertising on Instagram. And for that, we targeted the geographic area of New Mexico, ages 13 to 20, and then we added in further targeting by including interests like LGBTQ+, pride, transgender, things like that. The ads themselves linked directly to a web page that gave information on the survey, and then participants could click right on through. Super cost effective, and we got a substantial response. Overnight, our responses quadrupled from like a $2 investment in an ad. The survey was available between June and August of 2020, and at the end, participants were prompted if they would like to volunteer for an interview. The survey itself included several kind of large domains of questions. First, obviously, demographic questions. Then we used the Coronavirus Health Impact Survey, or CRISIS, the Youth Self-Report Form. It's a resource that was developed by the NIH, by a group working with the NIH. And so we pulled questions from that focused on health and exposure status and life changes due to the pandemic. We pulled in questions about safety and identity at school, home, and community based on GLSEN School Climate Survey. And then we pulled questions from the New Mexico Youth and Risk and Resiliency Survey, focused on violence, substance use, cyberbullying, self-injury, sadness and suicidality, and housing. And for those, the ones that had the 12-month time period in the YRS, we adjusted to a 3-month time period to try and capture what was going on specifically during pandemic time. And then we asked additional questions around various supports from school-based supports, mental health providers, virtual supports, and social network-based support. And I'll walk through some of our survey findings here. And as I do this, for ones that have a YRS equivalent question, I thought I would put in the 2019 data just as kind of a superficial comparison. We don't have a way of doing this officially, statistically. I'm not saying anything about the exact comparison here. But I thought it's helpful for context to see just kind of a superficial flush of what the differences might be between 2019 and 2020. And it's important to keep in mind too that we have slightly different populations here. So for the YRS data, we pulled in everyone who positively affirmed, yes, lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid. We've left out the not sures for the data that we'll be sharing here. And the time scale is different. So for our respondents, we had 379 self-identified LGBTQ+ youth respond. About a little over a third of our respondents identified as trans or non-binary. You'll notice here that those numbers add up to more than 100%. That's because we allowed folks to select more than one option to describe themselves. And then we had a fair amount of representation across the board from various sexual orientations. We had a fair distribution across kind of all the different age ranges there. We had a large number of American Indian, Alaska Native folks respond. And then about 42.7% of our sample identified as Hispanic. We allowed youth to identify where in the state they were located just based on kind of a general description of their surroundings. We allowed them to pick from rural, town or village, small city, suburb of large city, large city. And for our analyses, we combined suburb of large city and large city together and rural and town or village together. And it ends up being about a third, a third, a third. So first, we're interested in kind of these safety questions. So we asked if they'd ever felt unsafe at their school because of their sexual orientation, gender, or gender expression. And over 71% of responding youth said yes, they had felt unsafe. We asked the same question of home life, if they'd ever felt unsafe in their home before the pandemic and currently. And before the pandemic, 45.6 had said that they had felt unsafe in their home because of sexual orientation, gender, gender expression. And during the pandemic, 40.5 said that they felt unsafe. We also assessed kind of relationship strain during the pandemic. So during the past 3 months, has the quality of your relationship between you and members of your family changed? And a large number said that it was either about the same, a little worse, or a lot worse. We asked the same question about their relationships with friends. A little more than a third said about the same. 32.7% a little worse. 17.14 said a lot worse. So these questions are really getting at like what kind of stress is being put on these relationships during the pandemic. We asked other questions around kind of finances. So to what degree have changes related to the pandemic in your area created financial problems for you or your family? A little more than a quarter said not at all, and the rest said at least slightly through extreme. During the past 3 months, to what degree are you concerned about the stability of your living situation? A little less than half said not at all, and a little more than half ranged from slightly to extremely. And in the face of those kinds of stressors, we were wondering what kinds of supports were available. So school support, we asked whether or not someone from their school had reached out about non-school or work-related topics. 60.8% said yeah, that they had been contacted. A little less than a third said that they had not, and about 8% said that they weren't sure. We were really curious about kind of involvement in GSAs. So you can see that there's kind of this drop off of affirmative, yes, I've been involved in a GSA, to whether or not the GSA is still active. And back this past in the 2020 summer and early fall, folks were still trying to figure out how to do virtual GSAs. Based on interviews and current ongoing work with RLAS, we hope that that number has increased because students have been back in school, and those clubs are super important to SGM well-being and mental health. So we've been encouraging at least the schools that we work with to really try and start up virtual GSAs. We were asking about support from faith-based community pre-COVID and during COVID. You can see the differences there. We asked about online community support pre and during, as well as mental health provider pre and during. And the numbers kind of shifted towards the no during COVID. So this could be due to a number of things, whether or not those supports are still available, whether or not people know if those supports are still available, youth actually actively reaching out during this time, because we know that they, at least a couple of our interviews expressed that they had knowledge about the resources that are there, but they had difficulty actually making that step to reaching out. And so now I'll talk a little bit about the substance use and mental health outcomes that are mostly paralleled with the YRS data. So during the past 30 days, on how many days did you smoke cigarettes? This is specifically from our sample. So 90.7% said 0 days. And then it ranged from 1 to 2 up to 10 to 19. And a very, very, very small number said all 30. So just to compare, it looks like, even though I cannot say definitively, it looks like our sample had a larger number of folks saying that they had not smoked at all in the past 30 days versus the YRS sample from the previous year. How many days did you use an electronic vapor product? 76.08 said 0 days, and then a range throughout the rest of the options there. Compared to the 2019 data, it looks like we have a larger proportion of our sample that said that they had used an electronic vapor product 0 days. In terms of alcohol use, how many days did you have at least one drink? 65% said 0 days, 19.6, 1 to 2 days, 9.3, 3 to 5 days, and so on. Just comparing that again to the 2019 YRS, 61.3 versus 65 for 0 days. And you can see the differences there for the rest of the options. This one I find interesting personally, because it speaks to potentially the impact of the social distancing guidelines. So how did you usually get the alcohol that you drank? Here you see that there's either 0 or close to 0, where it says it's bought at a store, bought at a restaurant, bar, or club, bought at a public event. Awesome, because we didn't want people going to those anyways during this time period. And if you look at the YRS, there's a bit more there around bought at a public event, bought at a store, bought at a restaurant or bar. But then the old methods there of taking it from a store, a family member, some other way, someone gave it to me, are all still present. In terms of marijuana use, 68.11 said 0 times had they used marijuana in the past 30 days. 10.6, 1 to 2 times, 7.6 for 3 to 9 times, and so on. Just kind of a little comparison to the 2019 YRS, we had a higher portion of our sample say 0 times in the past 30 days, and the rest kind of fall in line with a similar kind of dip towards the middle and then increasing at the end. In terms of violence and bullying, during the past 3 months, how many times did someone you were dating or going out with physically hurt you on purpose? A little less than 60% said they did not date anyone. 35.6 said 0 times. 3.27 said 1 time. Little less than 1%, 2 to 3 times. And we have some small portions there for 4 to 5 times or 6+ times. Looking at YRS, we had a higher proportion of our samples say they were not dating anyone during this time period. A lower portion saying that 0 times, and a little lower for the others. How many times did someone in your family physically hurt you on purpose? 78% of our samples said 0 times. 5.57% said 1 time, 11.48 said 2 to 3 times, a little less than 2% said 4 to 5 times, and a little less than 3% said 6+ times. And for this one, I did not have a YRS equivalent to share for comparison. How many times did anyone force you to do sexual things that you did not want to do? A little less than 90% of our sample said 0 times. 5.26 said 1 time, 3.95, 2 to 3 times, a little less than 1%, 4 to 5 times, and a little bit 0.66% said 6 times. So just again to show the difference between our data and the YRS data, we had a higher proportion of our sample say 0 times for how many times did anyone force you to do sexual things that you did not want to do. And it's important to note here again the difference in time scale. So we're asking about the past 3 months versus the past year on the YRS data. During the past 3 months, have you been electronically bullied? 32.55% of our samples said yes, they had been, compared to 25.4% of the YRS from 2019 over the past year. For housing, during the past 30 days, where did you usually sleep? About 97% said in a parent or guardian's home, and we have a little bit of response around in the home of a friend, a family member, or other person, or somewhere else. We had a higher proportion, say, in a parent or guardian's home in our sample versus the YRS. Non-suicidal self-injury, sadness, and suicidality. Sorry, this is like the depressing section of the presentation. During the past 3 months, how many times did you do something to purposefully hurt yourself without wanting to die, such as cutting or burning yourself on purpose? 37% said 0 times, and then the rest we have a range between 1 time and 6+ times. And again, just showing the potential difference between 2019 YRS. In our sample, we had a higher percentage of folks say that they had engaged in some sort of non-suicidal self-injury. During the past 3 months, did you ever feel so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row that you stopped doing some usual activities? 83.39% of our sample said yes to that question. And in the YRS, there was 63.3% that had said yes to that question in the past 12 months. During the past 3 months, did you ever seriously consider attempting suicide? A little less than 46% of our sample said yes. And there's the comparison with the 2019 YRS, where 40.8% had said yes to seriously considering attempting suicide in the past 12 months. We also asked about planning. So in the past 3 months, did you plan about how you would attempt suicide? 32.88% said yes, compared to 34.21 in the 2019 YRS. And then during the past 3 months, how many times did you actually attempt suicide? 88.47% of our sample said they had not attempted suicide. 9-ish% said 1 time, 2% said 2 to 3 times, 0.34 had said 4 to 5 times, and 0% had attempted 6+ times. And so we see a higher proportion of our sample versus the YRS that said they had not attempted suicide during this time. But so as we are looking closer into some of these statistics, we really wanted to start teasing out some differences that might be more like usable or actionable for folks in New Mexico. And so we wanted to look at the differences between large city and suburbs, small cities, rural areas and towns. And we do see some differences here. And as we're continuing to do analyses with these data, the first one that we were kind of zeroing in on is the suicidality measures. If you look here, you can see there's some differences happening between these different geographic areas. And so we ran some analyses, or Alena did the analysis for us, and found that rural youth were significantly higher, had a significantly higher likelihood of considering suicide and attempting suicide compared to their urban counterparts, those that identified as living in large cities or suburbs. They were also, and then we wanted to look at kind of the combination of things about rurality and feeling safe at home. And so feeling unsafe at home was associated with higher likelihood of all three, considering suicide, planning suicide, and attempting suicide. And when we combine these, we found that sexual and gender minority youth living in rural areas who felt unsafe at home had a higher risk of suicidality in all three of those measures than their urban peers who felt unsafe at home. And you can see the odds ratios and p-values there. So they had a higher likelihood of considering, planning, and attempting suicide. Another kind of area that we're starting to do some analyses into is around virtual support. And so we conducted correlational analyses of mental health outcomes and virtual support and found that feelings of sadness and hopelessness correlated with seeking out or receiving support from virtual platforms before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So those youth that were experiencing sadness and loneliness, sadness and hopelessness were seeking out those types of supports before the pandemic started. Attempting suicide was correlated with seeking out or receiving support from virtual platforms during the pandemic. And yeah, so the time check. So these analyses really point to the fact that youth that need support are seeking out support, which hopefully means that they're getting the support that they need. But this underlines kind of the importance of virtual supports during this time. If people can't physically be together in a space, maybe they don't have access to other forms of support. These virtual kinds of interactions really are a boon for their resilience. And so just to quickly kind of run through some findings from the interviews, youth reported in the interviews that they had more time to work on their own mental health and more time to kind of figure out who they are. Behavioral health providers and school staff had some of the same types of observations. So these were things like they were free kind of from the stress of the school environment to experiment with gender expression. We heard multiple folks talking about trying on different clothes, playing around with makeup, decorating their virtual space for classes in a way that expressed them differently than they were able to do in a physical classroom. They also had a bit more privacy maybe at home to experiment where their family was safer than their peers at school to change up how they looked or how they expressed themselves. Youth and families were reaching out, and many were able to make use of support virtually. So a lot of our community partners really did pivot very quickly and got the word out. Those that were engaged in receiving support, either through community organizations or formal therapy, talked about being less likely to miss appointments, especially the behavioral health professionals we spoke to said that youth were very much less likely to actually miss their appointments if they didn't have to go anywhere, if they were able to just engage through the computer. Folks talked about complicated relationships at home, like we saw from the survey data. Many youth talked about needing to conceal their identities from their families, needing to speak with peers in ways that allowed them a bit more privacy. So chat, text messages, those types of things that were not out loud, where if you're in a small space, people could overhear. And they spoke to varying degrees of willingness of families to actually facilitate formal support. So even though youth expressed the desire to maybe see a therapist, family members were really the kind of barrier for them to access those resources. And like I mentioned, youth were finding really creative ways to stay connected. I don't know if anybody else remembers the like rush on Nintendo Switches that happened at the very beginning of this. But youth were talking about staying connected through games. So if they weren't able to actually communicate via text message or out loud, they would all gather on like the same island in Animal Crossing and chat that way. So they found ways to stay connected, really creative ways. And a majority of youth in the interviews indicated that community really was a source of pride for them in their identity as an LGBTQ+ person. And that type of pride came from their virtual interactions. One young person talked about one young trans person talked about how they were learning about different types of masculinity from folks on YouTube and people in various chat apps that they were in. They talked about the fact that not all men look like Chris Hemsworth or Chris Evans. And so that was really important for them to hear that type of messaging. So a note on kind of the outreach. So some youth interviewees were really unsure of what their schools were actually doing during this time. They weren't sure about what types of supports were available. Even though some school-based health centers were still delivering services virtually, most of the youth that I spoke with did not know that those services were available. Part of that is through the way that they were communicating with their communities. Stay off of Facebook if you want to reach anyone below the age of 22. That's basically what I was told. Almost all of the interviewees referred to Facebook as being for old people, and that line is like early 20s, so no one worry. But what we were finding was that those individuals that were connected were already connected, and those that were not, were not. So those people who had kind of a nice support network around them, they were engaged in these different activities. They were able to stay engaged or at least figure out how to re-engage. And those that were unaware of resources to begin with didn't really know how to go and find them. And so their suggestions were reaching out to youth where you would find them normally. So Instagram, TikTok, Discord, thinking creatively about technological ways of engaging. Think about chat, non-audio visual forms of communication, and think about the need for privacy. This goes for anyone who wants to provide any kind of supportive services to youth. If they're in a precarious home situation and they don't want to voice sexual orientation or gender identity, gender expression out loud where it might be overheard by someone and put them in a very dangerous situation, they really do rely on these non-verbal, non-visual forms of communication in order to get support. So especially in places where, if you're thinking about like the jetpacks, the Wi-Fi, if folks are all sharing one thing and they need to be fairly close to it, that makes it very difficult for a young person to reach out for confidential support. If folks need to drive to a school to sit in a parking lot to access Wi-Fi, it makes it very difficult to have a confidential private conversation in a car with your siblings and maybe a parent or some other person that was able to drive you there. And I'll leave you all with this quote that I really enjoy from one of our interviewees, and I've highlighted kind of the end point here. That everything's not great right now, so we're at the worst. Everything's going to get better after this. It's the rainbow after the storm. Almost across the board, every young person that I interviewed had this sense of hope about them, that right now, because all these horrible things are happening, people are hopefully going to be waking up to these things and be able to start coming up with really creative solutions. And so they all had this kind of hopeful attitude for after the pandemic, which I thought was really inspiring. So that's all I have for y'all today. I'll open up for questions. I see things lighting up on my screen, but I don't know exactly how to get to them. I figured out the screen share.
I think that I have answered a lot of them in text, but there was one question about when data are going to be available.
Yeah, so we are working on a summary report right now that'll report out just descriptive statistics for all of these things, including some of the questions that I wasn't able to share today. But send me an email and I'll get you on the list for people to send it to as soon as that's ready to go. This presentation will also be posted, I believe, so you'll have access to the slides. But the summary report will come out soon, and then we have some publications in the work for those kind of deeper dives into the differences between rural and urban for suicidality, virtual support, and things like that.
I just want to read a couple of the questions. Alena, thank you for answering those in the Q&A part of the webinar. I want to make sure that everyone can see them. So the first question came from Jesse. The question was for YRS comparisons. Is this comparing all youth or high school, all cisgender, or LGBTQ+? And Alena's answer was the YRS sample for these comparisons were just youth who responded that they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, gender fluid, genderqueer, or transgender. And then there was a question from Anne. I missed how large the sample was and how long did it take to complete the survey? Alena answered the survey was administered between June and August 2020. The SASE sample was 379 individuals. And did you mean how long it took for folks to answer the survey?
So I followed up there and it was about 35 minutes.
Great. A lot of great questions here. One from Cindy that Alena also followed up with in Q&A, but the youth that did seek support also had attempted suicide at higher rates. Did you all collect data on types of online services since many online counseling services opened, e.g. Talkspace versus local therapists via Zoom? And the answer was these data are cross-sectional, so it's possible that the youth who needed the most support were also the ones accessing that support. We did collect data about the types of online platforms that youth were using, but have not gotten a chance to dig into those data yet. They were asked separately about support from a behavioral health provider, and those outcomes were not associated with these negative outcomes. Thank you for those answers, really appreciate it, and those questions.
Thank you.
Are there additional questions or comments?
Definitely lots of comments about how much they appreciated the presentation. So thanks so much, Daniel and Alena. We do appreciate it. It's great information. And I wanted to echo what Cindy said. It's a lot to process. And so we're really looking forward to the follow-ups that you'll have. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So folks, we're going to break for lunch and we're going to resume at 1:30. Please feel free to stay logged in or rejoin the webinar using your personal link when we